Good morning. Thank you everyone for joining us for the third North Carolina Climate Change Interagency Council. Thank you to DNCR for once again hosting us in one of their lovely facilities. We are live streaming this meeting, so just be aware of that there's a camera and microphones here in the room, as you would expect. There's no food or drink in the auditorium, so if you have any, please take them outside. There's a vending machine downstairs and a snack room in the basement level if you need something during the break. If you would like to make an oral comment during our public engagement section, please sign up at the sheet out front at the registration table if you haven't already. Comments will be limited to 2 minutes. And at this time, it is my pleasure to introduce the Assistant Secretary for the Environment from the Department of Environmental Quality, Ms. Sheila Holman.
Good morning, everyone. First, let me say that Secretary Regan sends not only his greetings, but he especially sends his thanks to all of the agencies and all the great work that y'all are doing to implement Executive Order 80. On behalf of the Secretary, I'd like to welcome y'all to the third meeting of the North Carolina Climate Change Interagency Council. As you know, established by Governor Cooper under Executive Order number 80 on October 29th, 2018. Today, we're joined by members of the Governor's Office and the designees assigned by the secretaries of each of the cabinet agencies. Also joining this team is a newly formed group of agency staff that would lead their department's response to Section 9 of Executive Order 80. Section 9 requires the cabinet agencies to evaluate the impacts of climate change and integrate adaptation and resiliency strategies into their programs and operations. This section also requires agencies to support communities and sectors of the economy that are vulnerable to the effects of climate change. We're honored to be supported by a distinguished group of scientific experts that are renowned nationally for their contribution in this field. Our state enjoys the benefits of having the local presence from the Institute of Climate Studies, North Carolina Sea Grant, and experts participating in the U.S. Global Change Research Program. We appreciate your kind service to the state and look forward to exploring this journey with your assistance. We're also honored to have a group of stakeholders that are assisting the state to explore nature-based solutions to enhance the ecosystem resiliency and sequester carbon through sustainable management and conservation practices. We have a lot of ground to cover today, so I want to conclude by just thanking y'all for being here, and I look forward to making progress on this effort together with all of you. At this time, I'd like to introduce Sushma Mazemore. She is our Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Environment and our State Energy Director, and as she's coming up, I just want to thank her and her team for their dedicated efforts toward the implementation of Executive Order 80. Sushma?
So I am going to briefly walk through the agenda for today so you all are aware of what we're trying to accomplish. So Lucy, if you could actually forward it to the next slides. So the agenda is broken into 3 main parts. The first part, which is Section 2, we're going to give you a preview of how the state is going about implementing and reacting to the requirements of the Section 9 of the Executive Order. I'll do a quick presentation on the goals and the strategy, and followed by Jenny, who's going to talk about how the academics and the university sectors are collating and combining their efforts to assist the state. So we want to get a message out that there is opportunity to partner, collaborate with the state as we venture into this new part of Executive Order. We're also going to have the folks from NCICS that Sheila mentioned talk about the first goal that we're going to achieve under the Executive Order, and that is developing an updated climate science assessment for North Carolina. And then after the break, we will have folks from our stakeholder groups that's involved in the natural and working lands, the various subgroups that have been formed in the last 6 months on the type of activities that they are doing to address ecosystem resiliency, carbon sequestration, and other co-benefits of such actions in the environment as well as the natural resources protection. And then finally, we will talk about questions. We'll take questions from the public and comments in the last half hour of the agenda. And so with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to introduce Jeremy Tarr, who's from the governor's office, who's going to give an overview of the Executive Order 80 implementation.
Thank you, Sushma. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. As you can see from the agenda, we're not going to do a kind of agency-by-agency walkthrough of implementation update like we've done in prior meetings, but I do want to emphasize all of the work that continues to go on at the agencies, both to implement the general directives under the executive order and also the specific directives that we've talked about in prior meetings, including the good work the DEQ is doing on developing a clean energy plan. The Department of Commerce is working diligently on workforce assessments, given the transition to clean energy and clean transportation. DOT is going to give you an update on their work with the zero emission vehicle plan for the state, and the Department of Administration continues to work through the items mentioned in the executive order regarding the state motor fleet zero emission vehicle plan. So I want to acknowledge the work that continues to go on in those 4 departments, but also all of the departments. It's been really encouraging to see the enthusiasm with which the departments have taken the executive order and also sort of come up with ideas and are working through things that, you know, I and others maybe never thought about ahead of time, and that's part of the design of the executive order. So I want to just acknowledge all the hard work that's happening day to day in the state on this, and also express appreciation for your work and contributions through public info sessions, through expert roundtables with each of the agencies to make sure that your expertise and your voice is heard and reflected in these plans. It's extremely important, and I know it's taking time from all of you, but it's really time worth spent. So I want to acknowledge that as well and encourage you, if you haven't kind of made your voice heard and contributed to the departments, to reach out to them directly and do so. It is really important and timely that we're focusing on resiliency with this meeting, especially given recent impacts and ongoing impacts of climate change in North Carolina. Hardworking people are being hurt across the state and impacted by climate change. In Western North Carolina, we see erratic weather affecting apple growers and forcing ski areas to close mid-season. In Central North Carolina, we're seeing soaring temperatures kill poultry and crops, and robbing small business owners of income that they depend on. And unfortunately, in Western North Carolina, we know more than ever how vulnerable it is to storm surges, to flooding. And this is why, and we've seen last September, just 2 years after our state was deluged by Hurricane Matthew, Hurricane Florence slammed into North Carolina. Its powerful winds, as we all saw, and storm surge decimated coastal communities. It crushed tourism and our fisheries. The storm stayed for days, dumping trillions of gallons of rain, inundating communities, drowning crops, and bringing rivers to historic flood levels. Hurricane Florence caused over $17 billion in damage, led to 45 deaths, unfortunately. And just a month later, Tropical Storm Michael came through North Carolina and took additional lives and cost the state additional millions in damage. When storms shatter our lives, it's not enough to just pick up the pieces. We have to prevent this kind of devastation in the future. And that's why Governor Cooper is working hard every day to rebuild North Carolina stronger and smarter, including by directing DEQ through Executive Order 80 to develop a North Carolina risk assessment and resiliency plan. So thank you for joining the governor in that mission. We're all determined to make North Carolina resilient to climate change impacts. It's going to take all of our expertise, and I really appreciate your commitment to that. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for coming out this morning and participating. My name's Colin Miller. I'm with the DOT. Jeremy and Sushma said that each cabinet agency is not going to give their own update, and yet DOT is up here giving an update. I've got to stop picking the short straw. But to that end, all the cabinet agencies have been working hard, and one of the pleasures of this effort for me personally has been the fact that all the government agencies, or I've had to at least, I think everybody else has had to as well, get out of their silo, and we're working together. And that's been a really impressive effort so far, and I'd like to say thanks to Sushma for leading excuse me, because that's been really refreshing to see. The DOT's ZEV plan is at a very good state. I won't say excellent, only because when we started off with the ZEV plan and we started looking into it, everything seemed so daunting. But we put our team together, and I'm going to say thanks to a few people here without trying not to sound like a NASCAR speech at the end. But we had the North Carolina Clean Technology Center at North Carolina State. We've got some consultants, KPMG and Quest America helping us out. We have our own internal communications department. I have my colleague Heather Hildebrandt, who's in statewide initiatives. We got together and we formulated a plan. We have had public meetings across the state in Asheville, Charlotte, Raleigh, and Kinston, and we've taken a lot of public input. We had a high-level stakeholder meeting here in Raleigh the week before last, and that went really well. And so the reason we're at the very good stage now is that we've gone from the initial daunting stage into the weeds and collecting all the data. Now we're at the daunting stage again. There's a room somewhere that has so many post-it boards and post-it notes and emails printed out that somebody's got to collate, and we've got to get together and work out exactly how the plan's going to look. But we're in a great stage from the data collection. I appreciate everybody here in this room has participated. If you have not participated in one of those meetings, there's still a couple weeks left. You can go to the NCDOT website, look for the climate change page, and through that page you'll be able to go to an interactive survey. We'd like some information from you on what it would take you to buy a zero-emission vehicle by 2025. We've had some great feedback on the survey, so I'd appreciate everyone in the room going there if you haven't by now. When that survey ends, which would probably be mid-May, we'll take it down. That will be the end of our data collection. In the next 4 to 6 weeks, we hope to have a draft plan that we can circulate to the public for public comment. Right then, I told a bunch of people in a room the other day that by default, they were editors. Everybody in this room, by default, because you've heard me say it, are now editors. When that plan comes out for public comment, please take a look at it, and we'd really appreciate your comments. DOT has also been working with Department of Commerce and Department of Administration, looking in-house at what we can do for our own vehicle fleet and zero-emission vehicles. We're well on the way to formulating that plan as well. So, as I say, the state of DOT's plan at the moment is very good. The only thing that's stopping us from excellent is that we have so much data at the moment that the work's really begun to formulate the plan. So, with that, thanks.
So, Colin, you're very tall. Wait, I gotta keep going down. So we're going to transition to part 2 of the agenda, which is Introduction to Executive Order 80, Section 9. I labeled this as just a whole slew of things, from climate science to climate-related impacts, risks, adaptation, and resiliency planning. This presentation is put together just as a holistic view of what our current state of thought is on how to execute this plan. But before I get started, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about why this is important. Jeremy gave an introduction as to why this is so important to the people of North Carolina, our businesses and our communities. But it's also something that many businesses and local governments and many state governments across the country are doing. You may have heard of or read an article recently about AT&T. The reason these businesses are planning for climate-related impacts and their impacts to their business model is that it is having a significant burden on their operations and their financial well-being. Many credit rating agencies are requiring businesses and local governments to have some sort of a resiliency plan. So in light of that, there was an article in the recent newspapers and online about AT&T doing a study with the Argonne National Lab. And the reason they did that was they cited that almost $850 million was spent from this one particular company on disaster recovery since 2016. And they needed to understand what areas are at most risk and what actions they needed to take. So they worked with available data sets and the country's labs to develop a detailed map of where climate change will damage its infrastructure over the next 30 years. And they did this at the neighborhood level. And the analysis they produce are images of inland flooding, coastal flooding from sea level rise and storm surges and high intensity winds. And they did this for North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and became a pilot for companies like this in producing a roadmap for responding to the impacts of climate change. This mapping system and the tools that they developed took supercomputers to produce over a period of long time. If we as a state or as a company or an agency was to do this, it would take many years of analysis and computing power. So as we're talking, the science is evolving, the data and the information is available, is coming online. And so as an agency, we're not only struggling with how to go about doing this, but we're also trying to figure out what is the best tools and the best resources, who's doing what. So we're moving forward as best as we can, but we anticipate making some mistakes and coming back and redoing things. So as we talk to the public and the folks within our own agencies, we're in this together. We have never done this as a state collectively and holistically. But like AT&T and many other companies and local governments that have taken leadership in this area, we're taking our first step. And so what I'm going to first talk about is how we're going to address the requirements of Section 9. Section 9 has a specific directive for the Department of Environmental Quality. It asks DEQ to prepare a climate risk assessment and vulnerability assessment plan by March 1 of 2020. This is not just a DEQ-only plan, but it's a collective plan in cooperation and collaboration with all the agencies. In addition to that, all the cabinet agencies are required to look internally and assess the impact of climate change by evaluating how it's affecting the programs and operations that we manage and execute. Also integrating climate change mitigation and adaptation practices into our own operations, but the public and the entities that we serve. As a result of that, we need to look outward, and that requires engagement with the community, engagement with local governments, engagement with the businesses and the residents that we serve. So with that, I have worked with our group and some of the folks that have been helpful in trying to figure out what are our overall goals for achieving the milestones outlined in Executive Order 80. We have come up with 4 major goals. The first goal is to first understand what the science is telling us, and that requires developing an updated science assessment. And the reason I'm saying the word updated is current data are available at the global level, down to national level, then to the Southeast level. And today, some experts are going to talk about how we take that data and create it into a North Carolina usable, understandable data set such that decisions can be made and supported. And so we've dedicated a whole session on that. So goal 1 is really the discussion topic for today. In the future meetings, we'll be talking about goal 2, which is developing, conducting an assessment of what is vulnerable, what are the assets that we want to protect, that we value the most, that are impacted by climate change. And the combination of goal 1 and 2 would be culminating into an action plan, what we call a climate risk assessment and a resiliency plan. And this is what will be delivered to the council and to the governor by March of next year. And then finally, in taking the actions associated with goal 3, is working with the communities in helping prepare response strategies related to the impacts that they see at a local level. And so I'm going to, at the end of my talk, invite Tancred Miller to say a few things about how the coastal communities are being engaged by our divisions to help them develop resiliency plans. And I'm not going to go into the details here, but I decided to take a few minutes to outline some of the elements that would be, and it's a little hard to read on that side, but readable on this side, all the elements that are required in addressing each of these goals. Goal 1, as I mentioned, is doing the science assessment. And this is really looking at the data, identifying the key parameters that are of interest to us. There are a lot of variables that are tracked through massive data systems and monitoring systems. The question is, what is most important to the agencies and the decision makers in North Carolina? So Jenny and her team will talk about bringing that down to a manageable data sets that will be a reference document report, a tool for the agencies to move forward with. And it'll also be a tool for the business communities and local governments for their own planning and decision making. Goal 2, we're just getting started. After this meeting, we'll be convening with a team of folks to look at, based on the science data and understanding what the assets and the natural and the built infrastructure that we have, what is at most value to us, and what are the impacts of these climate scenarios onto those value systems. How do we want to prioritize what we want to protect the most in a time frame, short term, mid-term, and long term? And coming out of that is evaluating the time series and scaled and spatial understanding of the options that are available. And that's goal 3. Goal 3 is basically there are so many things we could be doing to create a complete resiliency to all the impacts, but there really isn't the time or the money to do that. So it requires prioritization of the options that an agency may take or a community may take. And so we're going to try to screen at a sector level or at an agency level. We're really not sure exactly how we're going to document goal 3, but it's in the process of planning and taking action. And then finally, goal 4 is community assistance. And I'm not going to go into that, but I'll have Tancred say a few things about some of the initial thoughts we're having on that. One quick thing I'm going to say before I get off the stage is this is not going to be done in a vacuum. We realize that there's a lot of good work happening, going on all over the state. And we're not even probably discovered all of it. Probably maybe 20, 30% of the folks have approached us as to how we can integrate their results. We have an open call for the academic and the scientific community to work with us. We have an open call for all the stakeholders that want to be partners. We may not know exactly how to integrate your products and your thoughts and your ideas, but please be patient and suggest the best way to integrate your ideas. At the end of the day, it's going to take a whole community. It's going to take financing options. It's going to take funding mechanism to implement these solutions. So we want to ensure that the stakeholder process does not result in just a plan that sits on the shelf, but it becomes an actionable strategy that becomes a roadmap for the years to come, and something that we come back and revisit and revise as more information and learning occurs. And then finally, in case you all don't know, especially online, our DEQ department has an EO80 website, and here's the link. Currently, you can go into it various ways, but you can track the agency's response, like Colin talked about and what Jeremy talked about, what they're doing on the various sections of the executive order by going through this website and going into the actual boxes that labels what the plans and specific activities are going on. But there's also a link to go to the specific departments that is working on climate change related issues. We are working on putting a list of contacts that will allow you to reach out to the organizational representatives so that we're not the bottleneck if there's something you want to get across. If you're interested in talking with DHHS, then there will be a list of folks that you can get in touch with. So with that, I'm going to stop my overview and invite Tancred to talk about how we're dealing with goal number 4.
morning. Apparently, I know how to clear a stage. Thank you, Sushma. So, on goal number 4, with the executive order's directive to include stakeholder input and engagement, we at the Division of Coastal Management, we've been, I guess, trying to be as transparent and inclusive for a long time. And that goes back to our earliest forays into dealing with sea level rise probably 10 years ago. We were approached last year by one of the planners, the chief planner for the town of Nags Head, who lives in Elizabeth City, works in Nags Head. She wanted to engage the northeastern communities to talk about resilience, just to get everybody on the same page. What are we talking about? What do we mean by resilience? What types of impacts are we seeing collectively? And how can we, as a region, begin to address some of these impacts? So we thought that was a great idea. We're happy to partner with the local governments on that. And we started planning a northern workshop. Soon after that, we were approached by the North Carolina Coastal Federation, who wanted to partner with us on a Coastal Resilience Summit, which would be a bigger event to bring together as many interested stakeholders as possible from the coast to talk about resilience. That was shortly after the governor signed the executive order. And we thought, well, this is a great opportunity to engage with stakeholders. Let's do a northern workshop, a southern workshop, and then the central summit somewhere in the New Bern area, ended up being in Havelock because of the hurricane. And we assembled a really good team of folks from state agencies, North Carolina Sea Grant, Coastal Federation, another group of nonprofits. We have folks from the local planning organizations, regional planning organizations. It's a pretty diverse group, and I think that's been the key to getting the buy-in at the local level, getting that transparency so everybody's engaged, they know what we're working on. We have folks from Cape Fear Public Utilities Authority. And so folks are really coming to us and saying, hey, can we be a part of this team? Can we be a part of this process? And it's worked really well. Christian Camrath, who's here, he's been spearheading, coordinating that team for us. So what we have now is a northern workshop that's coming up next week, Thursday, in Elizabeth City. And the focus of that one is to get the local government planners primarily, maybe managers and so forth, but local government staff, to get them on board with what are we talking about with resilience? What are our common risks? What are common threats? And what types of things can we ask for support from the state? And use this as a way to get that input for the executive order. Then on the 14th of this month, of next month, we'll have a southern workshop in Wilmington. And they're workshops, so they're not going to be huge, probably like 70, 80 people. I think the northern workshop is already full, and the southern is getting close to full, so really good response from the local governments. And then in June 11th and 12th, we have a summit meeting in Havelock, and that registration is open. If you go to our website, you'll see in the top banner there's a link to the registration. There's a small fee, but that'll get you lunches. And that's really is to say, okay, here's what we heard from the local governments at these 2 workshops. And here's some more detail about the science of climate change, how it's impacting the coast, and some of the ideas that we heard from these local governments at the workshops about how do we deal with this as a coastal region. And then start to formulate some more input for the plan. And then there was one more thing that was touched on here, and that's the support to the local governments. We also recently put together a website, a web resource, and this again is Christian, I'll point to him, put together a really good resource to help local governments understand what types of tools are available, what types of policies can they think about, what types of, or some examples from other areas, either within the state or outside the state, what types of local ordinances, for example, might be helpful. Where can you find data? Where can you find planning assistance? Where can you find financial assistance? All these things are put together into one portal that these local governments can use. And as we go forward with that, we'll continue to iterate that portal and give people sort of a quicker, how do you get started? I mean, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle. Where do you start? And so that's going to be the next step for this portal. So as we go through this process, we'll continue to develop that.
So looking ahead, Tancred's taller too. I don't think anybody's shorter than me. So looking ahead, the model that Tancred's team is putting together on engaging with the communities could be applied through other communities in North Carolina. We have metropolitan areas like the major cities that are already embracing and have the financing resources or the capability to prepare their own resiliency plans. But there are a lot of communities and towns that are in rural communities that need such assistance. So our thinking is that when we get to goal 4, we would apply the lessons learned, perhaps use that model to reach out to other communities with our partners and engage in that process. But for now, let's start talking about goal 1. And at this point, I'm going to invite Jenny to talk about what we have discussed in creating a broader partnership to assist the state. Jenny?
All right. Am I changing slides here? Down. Oh, okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. I want to begin by saying thank you to DEQ council members, fellow colleagues, academic colleagues, and those that are listening here and across the state. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here to talk about a number of topics that I'm going to cover today. My name is Jenny Disson. I primarily work in engagement at the North Carolina Institute for Climate Studies, which is part of North Carolina State University. However, we work and collaborate across all the institutions, academic institutions in North Carolina. We're located in Asheville with NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, which many of you may know is the world's largest archive of environmental data. We do more than data. We do a lot of science, assessments, monitoring, and it's just great to have a climate studies research institute located with the federal government data center. I can be a mouthful in terms of who I am, so I'm just going to skip that, but please come and see me if you'd like to know more about who we are as an institution. We've got a lot to cover today, so I'll be fast, and I recognize we're a bit behind time, so just bear with me as I go through a lot of slides pretty quickly. Okay. So Shushma did a great job laying out the goals. Climate science, climate information, climate assessments, risk vulnerability. One more that she doesn't know that's coming in her list is innovation and solutions associated with a risk and an opportunity. So today I'm going to just cover briefly, one more thing. I have not done this presentation in a vacuum. My colleague, Dr. Jessica Matthews of North Carolina Sea Grant, who I believe is also listening, sends regrets for not being able to be here. So she actually is one of our adaptation specialists and experts and is a significant contributor and a visionary in terms of looking at climate risk information and adaptation and resilience planning. So apologize, Jessica, for not getting you introduced. So we're going to talk about how climate assessments and climate science information fits with risk and resilience planning. It is a non-trivial task at our research institute in Asheville. We support and are the lead authors of the National Climate Assessment. And so what is that? The National Climate Assessment is a US GCRP Global Change Research Program activity that my colleague Chris Weaver is going to go more into. In that activity at the national level, we did a National Climate Assessment, most recently published in 2018. In that process, there is a methodology in terms of how do you progress towards resilience. There are many phases in adaptation. You know, where is North Carolina? And you would argue, if you can actually see the slide, that there are many phases: awareness, assessment, planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. We are in the awareness bubble. We're moving into the assessment bubble. There's a whole lot of bubbles beyond that. Implementation takes a long time. At the national level, we've been, working at this for years. There's a handful of assessments that have been done, and it is trickling down more and more at the state and municipality level. So we're just getting started, and any implementation of any adaptation takes years. And the message that has been really re-emphasized by my colleague Jessica is it's very easy to get focused on the plan. We can produce a plan, and that is obviously one of the significant goals. But, we at the academic level like to emphasize, and those adaptation specialists like to emphasize, to keep in mind that it's more than just about a plan. It's an iterative and a living plan. And bringing in decision makers, stakeholders, policymakers, all those that are in the community at the council level to help feed into what matters, what assets are at risk, what decisions are important early in the process is going to help develop an effective plan. An adaptation and a climate science assessment is one component. There are many components in this journey. So what I'd like to share with you is one framing of what implementing a resilience plan looks like. This is again pulled from our National Climate Assessment team, listed the citation at the bottom. There is a process for doing a resilience plans. Lots across the nations have been doing it. There are some that are well beyond just doing a resilience plan and into implementation. States like New York, California, Massachusetts have all experienced a lot of vulnerabilities, risks that I don't need to cover here. North Carolina is certainly one of those states that have experienced a lot of recent impacts, and it's trickling both at the economic level and also creating opportunities for research. So it's one thing to produce a report. It's another thing to actually take the assessment and engage with those that are most impacted, the engineers, the planners, the policymakers, understanding what matters and what needs to be addressed, and pulling that context in sooner into the science piece, into the adaptation piece, and into the implementation piece will just, again, result in a more effective planning process. You can see that there are many steps into this implementation. That is really not sort of the focus. However, it's very difficult to talk about a climate science assessment in its own vacuum. Understanding the context of what decision or what plan it's helping to inform is what the scientists appreciate, so that we produce the right information, the right set of science, and help identify what data gaps we have. So I will largely be focusing a lot of the rest of the conversation more on the science piece, but I wanted to put some framework and context of what a prospective vision could look like. These are all frameworks from the National Climate Assessment level. They're just one example. There are many examples. We're lucky in the sense that many of our academic experts in North Carolina were involved at the national level. So highlight again that there are two areas in this slide: the convening methods and the methods to assess the vulnerability. Top two, we're sort of in that phase of the circle. Okay. So beyond that, there are other experts, for example, Dr. Sierra Woodworth, who's formerly UNC Chapel Hill, now at Texas Tech, who has evaluated about 40 adaptation plans and about 10 resilience plans across the nation. And most recently, in fact, as we speak, Jessica, my colleague, is at the National Adaptation Forum. This slide was presented at the forum that she encouraged me to present here. So Dr. Woodruff analyzed all these plans and came up with some guiding principles. You might consider these as metrics of what makes an effective plan. These are things that we have already started to consider and put out there as we think through what makes an effective climate science assessment, what makes an effective adaptation plan, and what makes an effective guiding document for a resilience plan. So what are some of these? We just quickly covered them, and they shouldn't be a surprise, but it's really important to have this foundation of what makes a successful plan in the back pocket as we think through these other parts. Goals. We have our goals. They've been very simply and carefully crafted in the Executive Order Section 9, and I appreciate how Shushma helps to emphasize the importance of these goals. The goals only go to a certain point in the overall framework. We recognize that. It begins with goals. So I also want to thank North Carolina State and their leadership in actually developing Executive Order Section 9. Fact-based. We appreciate an engagement with the scientific experts and pulling together all the information across the state that has been researched, that has been analyzed, empirical evidence, using data that we have, data that's available, pulling in partners of the state climate office, our regional climate centers. North Carolina has a lot of excellent resources in the fact-based portion, and we are working with many or most or arguably all of them. Strategies, going to decision-making to ensure that the goals are achieved. Right? This is hard. This requires engagement and iteration with all that are part of the process. Public participation, this is one step. There are many steps. Tancred and others have already began the process of engaging at the local and the regional level. We need more of that. North Carolina is a pretty big state, mountains to coast, so the public participation, understanding, involvement, and perspectives vary. Taking into account what matters to different stakeholders is a non-trivial task. Coordination. Well, you'll hear from our national team and our experts that coordination of experts on the climate science side is already quite a challenge and an undertaking. The number of topics in terms of how many sectors are affected by a changing climate. It's all the sectors of the US economy, and you might argue it's all the sectors of the North Carolina economy. It's a lot to coordinate, and so there is a significant role required in understanding both from the expert side, from the impacted side, from those who will be reading, evaluating, monitoring, and will be affected. Implementation and monitoring, okay, that's where the rubber hits the road. And then recognizing that there is a state of the knowledge. We in the climate science side often talk about the state of the knowledge. There's a lot that we know, there's a lot that we don't know. It's a very large Earth system science. And then zooming down from a Earth system perspective down to North Carolina is its own complexity. So how are we going to traverse and manage a lot of this uncertainty? In my context of engagement, I always like to think of uncertainty as opportunity for innovation. So I spoke at the national level and some examples of frameworks, but there are other frameworks, and what you see on the left-hand side is a diagram produced by my colleagues, again, at UNC Asheville. It's the National Environmental Modeling Analysis Center, NEMAC. This is a framework that they use in engaging with municipalities and cities. You see the circle top left because NCIC's role is primarily in the data information and the climate science assessment piece of it. But you see all these cascading steps that come after the science. So understanding the context of how temperature, precipitation, humidity, wind, how do these factors matter? And they matter everywhere in most decision places. So when we started our engagement with Shushma and team, we sort of were blessed in a sense that some stresses were already identified. So some work had been done in identifying, what matters in the context of the different departments and in the context of what matters across North Carolina. So this was a place to start. Are there others? And what is the state of the knowledge in these areas is where we are today. And we're going to spend more time talking about that. This slide talks about the National Climate Assessment Stakeholder Engagement Process. I put this in here to say it's a lot of boxes. It's a lot of engagement. This is half the engagement slide in the sense that this is a diagram that depicts the National Science Technology Council, the Committee on the Environment, the US GCRP team, which actually convenes, co-authors, and issues the report, NOAA National Centers for Environmental Information, and the NCIC's TSU team that was involved in assembling not only the data analysis and all the charts and information, but also in the editorial aspect, and that I'm very proud of on behalf of my team, who are unable to be here. But then there's all the expert chapter authors. And then there's reviewers. And then there's all the pieces that happen after the fact, after the report is written. At a national level, of course, it's a different level of complexity, but in North Carolina, there is a lot of engagement to be had. So where are we today? I believe we started conversations with Shushma and team, maybe January, late January. We have made quite a head. I think we've made some good progress to get us to where we are today. Jessica, myself, and a handful of others have been involved in identifying the key science experts across the state It is not an exhaustive list, but it's a start. We invite opportunity for those in the room that if you would like to identify others, please come see Shushma, and let's get their names added to the list. So we're starting to keep track of, who would be on the advisory component of the overall assessment. And it's actually even a little bit more complicated because the climate science assessment is the part that NCICS is helping to support, but then there's the overall report. So, we'll have to kind of think through this carefully. We want to identify experts by different domain areas. So in the climate science world, we like to say, if you just are a precipitation expert, they don't do wind, they don't do humidity. So it's kind of identifying the right domain and the right expertise, both at the scientific side, or the climate science side, but also the areas that are affected, the sector side. And then there's adaptation experts and resilience experts. So those that understand the context of how these different variables and impacts fit into the adaptation and resilience plans. So we're in the process of identifying additional experts. We have started to reach out, but we will, and we're very much in the process of reaching out. So unofficially, that has already happened. Officially is yet to happen. We are looking for an advisory committee. There are core members of this advisory committee. We're going to be working with Shushma and team to make sure that the right folks are identified. This is not done in a vacuum. So behind me is a whole team of 35 experts that are part of my research institute and my 2 or 3 bosses that are very much involved. Otis Brown, Dr. Ken Kunkel, and Dr. Dave Easterling. I also wear 2 different hats in the sense that I support the federal data center activities as well. And so in through that, we have a reach into pulling in other experts that are part of the NOAA Regional Climate Center members that are located here in North Carolina. So, members of the State Climate Office and so on and so forth. So it's possible that, there are other institutions and organizations that exist in the different pockets of North Carolina. We want to make sure that we're about as inclusive as we possibly can be, pulling in the right set of experts. But there will be gaps, and, we just need to work together. So as you are reached out to with information to help validate, confirm, or identify gaps, please, we ask for input and review along the way. Okay, so here's just a start. Here's a list of all the people that we have identified to date. Just to give you some flavor, so these are experts on the climate science side, arguably. Many of them extend beyond just the climate science side. We also have the stakeholder list that Shushma has put together, so these are executives and the working group members. So that's very helpful as we start thinking about identification of what assets, what programs, what activities are affected and impacted. So where is the state of the knowledge from those that are experiencing the vulnerabilities? So that list has been started, and we've already had 1 engagement meeting that took place on April 8th that has provided to be very beneficial. I'm going to talk more about that shortly. Here's one list of the DEQ Section 9 members. So, we're pulling together all of these different stakeholders that will be part of this journey. So what's next? On the climate science assessment side of things, we will begin to reach out to the experts to either self-select, self-identify, make sure that we have all the key areas and domain areas covered. Making sure that we identify the sectors and the domain is something that the advisory team will help define. And from there, we'll just, start the process. So let me stop there in the context of how we will be enabling the subject matter expertise on the climate science side of things.
So at this stage, we're going to transition to item number 3 on the agenda, which is discussing the process for developing the North Carolina Climate Science Assessment. So Jenny, if you'd like to bring your team up on the stage, and I'll let you sort of make up for the time if possible. We might have to cut the break short. So.
Sounds good. Yeah, where are we at? There you go. Great. Let's see. Okay, great. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Shushma, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. My name's Chris Weaver. I have a couple different affiliations today. My affiliation is the U.S. Global Change Research Program for the purposes of this discussion. So my colleague Adam Taranto is going to talk about, what the science tells us from the most recent Southeast Regional Climate Assessment from the fourth National Climate Assessment that came out day after Thanksgiving last year. But before getting into that, sort of zooming into the Southeast, we thought it'd be useful to give a little bit of a broader context, the kind of structure and process of the National Climate Assessment for a couple different reasons germane to this discussion here. First, because in a way, in a number of different ways actually, the National Climate Assessment provides a foundation for any subsequent downscaled state-level assessment, like one that is just beginning to get underway here for North Carolina. And so in terms of the fundamental science, underlying data sets, capabilities, expertise, human capital, and also, in addition, frameworks for thinking about how you can take climate science sort of writ broadly and national level results and contextualize them for the particular challenges for a state like North Carolina. And so I'll give a little bit of that context, process, and then I'll tee up Adam. So just for apologies for those for whom this is already very familiar, but the national context for the National Climate Assessment process is the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and U.S. GCRP was established by an act of Congress, the Global Change Research Act of 1990, with actually very large kind of bipartisan consensus, and it's created this organization, which is a consortium, a federation of the 13 federal agencies that primarily fund climate and global change research. And it mandated these agencies through the vehicle of US GCRP to do a number of different things. First and foremost, to cooperate and coordinate in doing climate science research, but also to carry out a number of specific tasks, one of which was to develop a quadrennial national climate assessment. And this national climate assessment was supposed to look at a number of specific things related to the impacts of climate change on the U.S. And its regions and its socioeconomic sectors, its populations and communities. And so this is the actual language from the Act: not less frequently than every 4 years, U.S. GCRP shall prepare and submit to the President and Congress an assessment which looks broadly across U.S. climate science, integrates and synthesizes across it to draw kind of high-level conclusions about what is happening with climate and how it relates to the U.S. Now, what we're observing across regions and sectors, and then project into the future. Both the sort of near term, and so near term from climate sciences, a couple decades, and long term, the rest of the century. And there have been 4 national climate assessments. The last 2, one came out in 2014, and then the most recent one came out in, to date, they had only come out as sort of individual volumes, but as the kind of depth of knowledge, and as I'll explain in a minute, the sort of questions being posed to the assessments have grown in complexity. This one was released in 2 volumes. The first one, what was called the Climate Science Special Report, which came out in November 2017, and then the Fourth National Climate Assessment Volume 2, which focused on impacts, risks, and adaptation in the United States, which came out about a year later, a few months ago. So just quickly summarize, you know, a big part of the show for these national climate assessments is to kind of report the new news. You know, what has happened in terms of our understanding of the science since the last time we, you know, put out findings of the program. And so from the Climate Science Special Report, which takes climate change through this lens of a kind of a global Earth system problem, what is happening in the Earth system that we can observe and that we can model, what have we learned since, you know, the literature of a few years ago, what are the key advances that we can report to the American public. Some of the key highlights for the Climate Science Special Report were advances in our ability to detect, attribute, and understand extreme events. And extreme events, this is very important because, of course, extreme events are a very, very key driver of the most, in many ways, visible and often consequential impacts of climate change, as well as a lot of additional much higher resolution, updated scientific information, both observed and projected future changes in key climate variables. And this is going to be important for understanding impacts on the southeast of the US and developing a North Carolina specific assessment, whether we're talking about extreme heat, extreme precipitation, sea level rise, coastal flooding. There's a sort of a vast database underpinning the National Climate Assessment that can be leveraged in the context of the North Carolina assessment. Similarly, and I'll just pass over this one really quickly because Adam's going to get into kind of the meat of the science results as they pertain to the Southeast. Volume 2, which came out a few months ago, is focusing on now in the context of these changes in the physical climate system, what are the impacts on natural systems, communities, populations, socioeconomic sectors? What does that look like in a kind of place-based sense across the country? This is just sort of gives a sense of the development timeline and the process. The main points here, though, are that the process is a very critical component, having the right process for developing these national climate assessments. It's critical that, as Jenny alluded to in her talk, draw on a wide range of scientific and technical inputs representing a lot of different perspectives, disciplinary and otherwise, provides a lot of opportunity for stakeholder engagement. There's clear and transparent communication in all directions throughout the process. And of course, the scientific underpinning has to be rock solid and therefore ensured by a number of review processes. And this is just a little graphic, which I won't go into, but which kind of illustrates the extensive public engagement that was the public participation process that was developed for the Fourth National Climate Assessment to engage members of the public, interested stakeholder communities across the country in providing input that informed the development of the Fourth National Climate Assessment and also created constituencies, audiences for communicating the results of the assessment to which we can go back. This just gives you a sense of the scope and breadth of NCA. It has been described by a lot of different people as it's really one national climate assessment and 10 regional assessments, one of those regions being the Southeast. So the last thing that I'll say before I turn over to Adam is, we've been assessing climate science for a few decades now. The climate science as a field has really sort of matured over the last few decades, and we've been doing these kinds of scientific assessments. The nature of the questions that are being asked to frame these assessments has changed over that time as we've understood more about the climate system. we've moved from these kind of physical science questions situated primarily in understanding, what's happening to the Earth system at a global scale. Is the climate changing? What's causing it? What are sort of the primary kind of physical impacts? To much more kind of socio-ecological, socioeconomic types of questions rooted fundamentally in place and in the sort of systems that people care about and the kinds of impacts that climate change is starting to have now and will have progressively more in the future on their lives. And so the structure of assessments has changed. And in particular, and Adam is going to sort of lay out how this is starting to be instantiated for one part of the country, one part of the assessment, the Southeast. Assessments are now, the state of the art for scientific assessments is centering them around risk, framing the scientific information around the information that's needed, the insights that are needed to understand the risks that are faced by a particular region, to provide information that assists stakeholders, policymakers in formulating solutions, actions for managing those risks. And so Adam is going to talk about, what that's starting to look like, as we're moving in this direction at the national level for the Southeast Regional Climate Assessment, which is the part of the NCA 4 that provides, I think, a kind of direct foundation for the next step, looking at North Carolina specifically. Adam?
Hey, good morning. So my name's Adam Tarando. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey with the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is actually located here in Raleigh, and we're a joint federal university research institute. So I get to work with the federal government, but also my office is on campus at NC State. So it's a really great job. So thanks for having me here. Yeah, we're going to go in and talk about the a couple different topics, but starting with the Southeast chapter of the National Climate Assessment. So this is what Chris was alluding to earlier about, one national assessment, but then all these different sort of regional assessments rolled into it. So we have these two volumes. The one on the left is the Climate Science Special Report, and then the one on the right, Volume 2, which Chris talked about, is all the impacts, adaptation, and risks associated with those climatic changes. I'll just give you 20 minutes to read all this text. No, just kidding. This is just to summarize how we frame the chapter in terms of these 4 key messages related to urban infrastructure and health risks, increasing flood risks in coastal and low-lying regions, natural ecosystems being transformed, and then economic and health risks for rural communities. So we spent the bulk of the time and effort on this report, at least the intellectual effort on it, was spent coming up with these key messages, because that really is sort of the heart and soul of this assessment report, is because those then speak to what are the values that are shared across the region or the community, and coming up with those or articulating those is no small feat. And then what's at risk as it relates to climate change and the impacts of climate change that could affect those things that we value. There's 4 key messages. I'm only going to read key message 1. And because I want to give you a feeling of then how that translates into the actual text and the result of that. So key message 1, urban infrastructure and health risks. So we say many southeastern cities are particularly vulnerable to climate change compared to cities in other regions. So we're trying to make that comparison off the bat with expected impacts to infrastructure and human health. The vibrancy and viability of these metropolitan areas, including the people and critical regional resources located in them, are increasingly at risk due to heat, flooding, and vector-borne disease brought about by a changing climate. So what do we value and what's at risk? But then we also wanted to incorporate different opportunities, adaptation opportunities, or other sorts of innovative opportunities that might be present themselves going forward. So many of these urban areas are rapidly growing and offer opportunities to adopt effective adaptation efforts to prevent future negative impacts of climate change. And that was another big part of then the volume 2 of the National Climate Assessment, is giving examples of those types of adaptation opportunities and things that people are already doing or that are planning to do or could be done. We thought it was very important as part of the National Climate Assessment to engage in that visioning process, give examples of what we mean and what could be done in response to climate change. So then key message 2, again, that's flood risks in coastal and low-lying regions. Key message 3, natural ecosystems will be transformed, and I'll give some visual examples of all these different key messages. And then number 4, economic and health risks for rural communities. We felt it was important to include that because, you know, until just the last few decades, the South really was primarily a rural region, and still most of it is a rural economy in rural places. But and so we wanted to make sure that that was captured in one of our key messages, the risks that accrue in rural areas. So we started off with some background and this is sort of that downscaling from the national level to the regional level. So the national scope, you know, probably had something like, well, it did have things like extreme heat days. This is showing our observed changes in number of days above 95 degrees or number of nights where the minimum temperature did not get below 75 degrees. So you might have had something like this at the national level, but it usually was the Southeast would get kind of smushed out, or maybe it wasn't at a threshold that was more meaningful to us because it wouldn't have been very meaningful for the rest of the country, for example. So, you know, in San Francisco, I don't think they've ever had a minimum temperature above 75 degrees, for instance, right? So we went to folks that was with the Technical Support Unit, which is run out of NCICS and NCEI out in Asheville, and folks like Ken Kunkel, we asked them if they could do this sort of analysis for us as part of the assessment in our region, and they were happy to do it. And so I say. And so then we have further analysis that sort of, again, downscales to our region. This is the looking at across the region number of nights with a minimum temperature greater than 75 degrees. But then we translated that into the projected future as well. So using the climate model analysis to then understand, okay, so if you're looking at what are different potential futures, and so throughout the National Climate Assessment, we settled on these 2 greenhouse gas emission scenarios. We just call them the lower and the higher scenario. If you want the technical terms, we can talk about that later. And that, you know, sort of doesn't bracket the uncertainty because we don't know what humans are going to do in the future, so we can't have any sort of scientific likelihood of which one of these is more likely to happen. But it does give you an idea and a scenario of if this were the future and how it played out, what might the climate response be to that future level of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, and so then again, speaking to that key message 1, we talked about vector-borne diseases, so things like you know, mosquitoes from Aedes aegypti, those sorts of diseases like dengue, chikungunya, Zika, those are things that are all on our radar now in the region. And we had some interesting work that was done that we highlighted for the Southeast, because obviously you can see from this map that the Southeast really is sort of the primary region in the continental U.S. where that's going to be an increasing risk in the future as the climate warms. So moving into key message 2, we talked about coastal and low-lying areas and the risk there, and obviously this is something that I do not need to belabor this. We are all very much aware in North Carolina of this sort of risk, but we have really good analysis that has been done by folks at NOAA like Billy Sweet, and they've been able to do this at a really local level up and down the coast, particularly where you have different tide gauges and other sort of localized data, showing, first of all, what's our occurrence of high tide flooding in the past, and these are those sort of sunny day floods or, you know, recurrent flooding, like you go down to the coast and it's a beautiful sunny day out and there's water on the street and on the road, right? And so, but also then projecting that into the future under different sea level rise scenarios, what might that change in frequency look like? How many more days of that sort of nuisance flooding, whatever you want to call it, would we have to deal with over time? But then again, we have an example of adaptation. So, this is showing something from Charleston, South Carolina, where they're taking steps to improve their stormwater infrastructure to deal with these sorts of increased risk of flood events that they have. So this was, again, really important to show different types of adaptations that are occurring. And it also speaks to sort of the trade-offs that come with climate change, right? It's like, okay, well, if you're going to have this level of warming that's related to this level of emissions, then you might have to deal with that. This is kind of a cost of climate change, right? This is kind of a cost of adaptation. And then again, showing in these low-lying regions how it's not just hurricanes and storm surge right at the coast, but again, we're all very familiar with this. It's the amount of rain that gets dumped on us from hurricanes and other storm events, the extreme precipitation events that are becoming more salient and more frequent and more extreme. And then we did talk again, we brought the science back in to have more of a focus on that in our region, because there was a lot of discussion of hurricanes at the national level in the Climate Science Special Report, but they couldn't go into detail in terms of things like this. But also it was great having 2 volumes and sort of staggering those reports, because then as sort of late breaking things happened, like in this case we were talking about Irma, we were able to incorporate them that they were not able to incorporate in the previous volume. So as new science emerges or new sort of information and insight emerges, we can include that. All right, so then for natural ecosystems, the next key message, we talked about things that we thought, we talked about a lot of ecological transitions across the region, but also wanted to relate these things to just that everyday people that aren't ecologists and biologists would understand and maybe relate to. So in this case, we were looking at changes in plant hardiness zones. So you go to Home Depot or Lowe's and get your seed packet, and you look on the back when you're supposed to plant those seeds. Well, we wanted to be able to show people what that might look like in the future in terms of what sort of crops could be grown here or might not do very well here in the future if they're not very tolerant of different heat or need a different type of growing season. But then getting back to that really sort of stark ecological changes, some of those things that we project could happen in the future or that are happening now. So things like transitioning coastal wetlands from one type, say this salt marsh community type, to mangroves. So mangroves are very sensitive to winter minimum temperatures, and there's this very strong relationship. And so as minimum temperatures in the wintertime warm, you would expect mangroves to transition and become more dominant. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a shift and a change in these areas where it would happen. And so we would have to think about how does that change management, the type of species you're managing for, or the type of ecosystem services and benefits that would be provided. And then again, other types of ecological, biological risks. So invasive species, warm winters favor these types of invasive species. This is the Burmese pythons, which are just running rampant in South Florida right now. There's just a lot more species in the tropics, and as the climate warms, more and more of those could radiate out into our region. So we highlighted that. And then again, sort of like existing adaptation efforts that sort of already we're in a good spot in terms of managing some of these risks that you would expect with climate change. So out west, wildfires are just a huge risk, and it's really hard to manage those fires every year that they get. In the southeast, we do have that risk, but we also do a huge amount of prescribed burning. I think we have the most amount of prescribed burn acres in the country in the southeast, and that really helps mitigate the risk from wildfires. So we really wanted to help. We wanted to highlight that as sort of an example from our region and a real success story. We also talked about things that are important to like indigenous communities in the southeast, so other communities that have like that sort of deeper ecological knowledge, traditional knowledge, and the risks that would accrue due to climate change to things like ramps. This is showing ramps out in the mountains that are very heat-sensitive plants. And then finally, in those rural areas we talked about, this was an analysis that was initially done by EPA that we highlighted in our report, and I think really kind of got picked up as interest, is showing the projected changes in hours worked across the country by the end of the century, just because it gets too hot outside to work in the daytime. So this is maybe something you wouldn't think about right away with climate change, but then when you do the analysis, you're like, oh yeah, that's pretty obvious. That's going to be a major shift, and there'll have to be some kind of adaptation efforts for that. Maybe work starts at 4 a.m. now, something like that. So you're done by noon. So that was the Southeast assessment, and you can check it out online and all that. And now I'm going to transition right into the next talk. My colleague and Jenny's colleague, Ken Kunkel, he could not make it today, so I'm giving this presentation on behalf of him and NCICS, so it's mostly NCICS, but I couldn't help myself and added some of my slides, so that's why you can blame me also, so my name is up there. So we're going to talk now about climate information for North Carolina, and we're going to review some of the results from the National Climate Assessment and then some initial updated North Carolina specific climate science analysis. So, and I've also told Jenny, or asked her, please interrupt me if I get anything wrong about NCICS, since I am not an NCICS staff member. So, Jenny, do you want to say anything more about NCICS now, or you want to? We can talk more about it later. Yeah. Okay. So, backing out to just why we're all here, I show this this a lot. This is showing observations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So on the left is showing all the measurements we have across the Earth by latitude. On the right is a time series from Mauna Loa. And so you can see this is measured in parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we're going up to the present day. Now we're going back to 1959. And now we're going to go back to proxy records of CO2 further into the past, while the amount of CO2 stays constant on the right here. So now we're back 2,000 years. Now we're going back tens of thousands of years, 20,000 years, 40, 50, 60,000 years. Now you start to see the ice ages show up, 200,000 years, all the way back to 800,000 years. And you can see where we are right here compared to the last 800,000 years of CO2 history. So the point here is that this is just an enormous amount of carbon to, in terms of geologic time, dump into the atmosphere instantaneously. This is not really a trend. This is like an instantaneous moment in time as you extend back the time series into further back into the Earth's history than humans tend to think on their time scales. So that's what then causes, right, that's why we have this level of warming we've had across the globe. And I like to think about like really three big changes, three big physical changes that result from that on the climate science. One, it gets warmer. Okay, and this is the one we all are pretty familiar with. Two, it rains harder. And three, the seas rise, okay? You can think of those as sort of the three big takeaways from climate change. If you go home and talk to your family or neighbors or someone, you can kind of remember those three things, the big things that happen with climate change, right? So the first one with it gets warmer. We've seen these, we know that now there are very strong trends in warming across the globe. This is almost across the entire Earth, there has been warming now over the last century or more. If we drill down into the U.S., so I'm showing graphics from the Climate Science Special Report, so this is volume 1 of the National Climate Assessment. It gets a little more complicated, though, because now we're drilling down at smaller scales. And what's interesting, of course, is that in the Southeast, we are the special part of the country. So we are the one part of the country, and really one of the very few parts in the entire world that has shown some cooling trends in parts of our region. So there's some reasons, different hypotheses for that, but that is just sort of an interesting artifact of our region. Overall, though, we've seen this ratio. slice and dice this warming in different ways to get an idea of what's happening. So this is showing the ratio of daily temperature records over time. And so you see more, if there were an equal number of warming or record highs and record lows, you would see nothing on this. It would just be a flat line at the bottom. But what you've seen is this spike in many more daily record highs in recent years. So this is a ratio of, for instance, 7 to 1, 7 times as many daily record highs as daily record lows. And then we use climate models to then understand the climate system and then project into the future. If we have different levels of greenhouse gas emissions, what would the result be? And so we see these projected temperature changes globally over time. And again, these are those different emissions scenarios. So this is our higher emission scenario, and this is our lower emission scenarios. There's 2 of them here. And then again, sort of like thinking about what this might mean in the future if you drill down to the national level and look at a more maybe salient measure of climate change. So this is showing 5-day annual maximum temperatures. So change in annual highest 5-day Tmax over time, and you just see that we expect that those really warm maximum temperatures by the end of the century, if you continue on that higher emission scenario, you'd see a really large increase in maximum temperatures. So that's the first one, it gets warmer. Second one, it rains harder, okay? We're seeing a lot more of this. Why is that? Well, a warmer atmosphere will basically have more water in it, okay? A warmer atmosphere will contain more water vapor. This is something called the Clausius-Clapeyron relation. If any of you took meteorology, you probably learned about this. And so the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere increases as the temperature increases, and that's a pretty basic relation that we know. And so then that translates, there's all sorts of sort of mitigating and complicating factors when that translates into our actual atmosphere. But we still see the basic pattern here is that water vapor content is increasing in the atmosphere, and we project that it will continue to do so. Again, depending on which emission scenario we are on. And so that would increase the rainfall rates that we would expect to occur when it does rain in the future. So then just backing out and looking at our observed trends, we see that overall precipitation has increased across the country, but it varies a lot depending on what season you're in and where you are across the country. Okay. Overall, we expect a warmer planet, but your mileage may vary, right? But really where we're seeing sort of consensus on these changes, are those extreme precipitation events. So again, as you sort of juice up the atmosphere, you can get these more extreme precipitation events through time. And we're seeing that trend making itself apparent now in the observations. If you break this up regionally, this is showing the observed trends in heavy precipitation, or the number of 5-year 2-day events. So how many of those extreme events over a 2-day period would you expect to occur over a 5-day period? And those are increasing quite a lot in our region. They've increased by 58% since the beginning of the 20th century. And then, of course, just anecdotally, we're very familiar with this, right? This is showing the radar estimated precipitation totals from Florence and just the devastation that caused when you have, a hurricane in that case that was able to just rain out over and over again. If we project into the future, it gets a little messier because, again, it's not, some areas we do expect to dry in the future, even if they're getting more intense storms while they're drying. But some areas we expect to get wetter overall too. With the Southeast, it's really sort of a mixed bag. We're really not sure yet. It could be wetter, it could be drier. We think maybe in fall, it could be wetter falls in general, but even that is a little bit hard to nail down. So we're not sure on the overall amount of precipitation for our region. But we are have much higher confidence that when it does rain, we'll get more deluges. So maybe fewer showers, more dry days, but when it does rain, it's going to pour. Okay. So the last big effect then is that the seas will rise, okay? And so we know this happens from melting ice and expanding oceans. And we see these more sunny day or recurrent flooding. We've seen this, and I already pointed out some of this analysis. This is showing for Wilmington, observed and projected number of tidal floods for Wilmington. And so the observed are the bars here, and then we see going forward what would be projected into the future. Basically, there's a risk of just recurrent flooding without any changes every day of the year. We don't expect more hurricanes, but we expect when hurricanes do happen that there's a greater chance they will be more powerful. Okay, so things like Maria, things like Harvey, things like Michael, things like Florence. Remember, Florence actually was a very strong hurricane at times out in the Atlantic before it made landfall. So summarizing that, overall, has extreme weather increased? Again, those more salient measures in terms of the consequences and what's at risk. There's a global increase in heat waves, decreases in cold waves. Those extreme rain events have translated into things that can translate into more floods, more flood events. All the above are consistent with what the science tells us, the physics tells us we would expect from global warming. But for the future, it's more unclear on a lot of these. And so we're going to have to see. And it's sort of a mixed bag. It gets complicated. Again, for hurricanes, we don't expect the total number to increase. But we do expect those stronger storms. There's a greater risk of those stronger storms forming and getting more of those in the future. All right, so finally then, just some really quick preliminary analysis that Ken and his team have done for North Carolina. So if we think about, again, splitting the National Climate Assessment into the Climate Science Special Report, Volume 1, this is the Climate Science, this is the Adaptation Science in Volume 2. You can sort of make that parallel here in terms of climate information, in terms of these are the things that NCICS either has done or can do. But then these are the things on the adaptation, the impacts, adaptation, and risk that you're going to have to talk to or work with subject matter experts and other stakeholders to either obtain that information or figure out which sort of metrics and variables you want to examine. So again, we're talking about here what can be done in North Carolina in terms of the Climate Science Assessment Report, and so you need to identify that science information that can assist in the adaptation and impacts and risk planning. These are some of the things that have been done so far. So this is similar to analysis that have been done for the NOAA NCEI climate summaries for the whole U.S. And NCICS has started to update that analysis. It was done initially, I believe for 2014 was the last year. So this has been updated now to 2018. And this is the observed temperature change over time in North Carolina. This would show what the climate models have shown historically, if you run their experiments. And then this would be what the climate models would project into the future, again, under two emission scenarios, a higher greenhouse gas emission scenario and a lower greenhouse gas emission scenario. And this is just, again, looking down in a different way, showing the observed changes. I think Ken's point here is that you can get these by different seasons as well. So you can see how climate has changed so far in the state by season. You can look at it by different aspects of temperature, so like maximum daily temperatures, minimum daily temperatures. This is something we see a lot where there's not as much, there is a trend in maximum daily temperature. It still doesn't necessarily compare to the just extremely set of hot summers we had in the 1930s. But minimum daily temperature, we see a much stronger increases recently. Again, showing different extremes, things that are of really high impact and therefore consequence. So extreme hot days, warm nights, very warm nights. That's a really big health risk, right, if you can't cool down at night. And then precipitation, moving to precipitation as well. So maybe annual precipitation is useful from a broad planning perspective, but what's really important for then in terms of the biggest risks are, again, those extremes. So this is showing Number of precipitation events where you had an inch or more of precipitation. This is the average across, I believe, different long-term monitoring stations in North Carolina. And then you can slice that even more and look at, say, 4 inches or more, which would be a really sort of catastrophic event in a lot of places, cause a lot of flooding. And also, there's an initial analysis or analysis that is prepared and ready to be used along the coast. Again, this is that analysis done by Billy Sweet and his colleagues for NOAA. And that's just a really amazing resource, I think, that we have for the coast. And finally here, wrapping up, this is some brand new analysis as well. It's been done showing from NKICS, showing like the annual hottest days and showing like then what the models, climate models would project for the future, both for daytime heat index and nighttime heat index values. So again, showing that sort of, measures of consequence, measures that really matter for things that we value, health, property, natural ecosystems, agriculture, the economy, all of that. So those sorts of analyses that can be done through NKICS as part of the climate assessment. And so I'm just going to end it there and turn it back over to Jenny now.
Thank you, Adam. You've covered quite a breadth of information from the national level to a regional level and to North Carolina level, which needs to be scaled down even further. So there's a lot of technical information, and it takes a team of people to do this. There's more information. And I think, there we go. Okay, so the next part of the conversation, which I'll cover again pretty quickly, is, where are we today? What's some of this initial perspective on the activities for the North Carolina Climate Science Assessment? Again, it's not done in a vacuum. It's done with a whole team of people, and we will pull in some more science experts as we go along. I'm just thinking about the amount of information that we just shared today, and it's quite a lot. So when we think about a science assessment, well, let me characterize. We talked about an adaptation plan at the national level. We talked about a climate science special report at the national level. And now we're thinking about it at the North Carolina level. So there are lots of different ways to go about it. But really, you might think, we're developing all this information, this climate science information and its impacts, and then we can just apply it into a report that would help kind of interpret the data and the charts and the information and put it into some decision context. Well, we think it sounds like a fairly straightforward linear process. Climate science experts provide future global climate model information. A group of people in all these laboratories and these scientists that really understand the physics of the system run these global climate models. Then there's regional climate model scenarios. Then there's local environmental conditions, and there's local environmental impacts and other economic and social impacts. And then there's consequence that has to be addressed. Consequence and opportunity. We know it's not a fairly straightforward process. It's not something that you can just take all this amazing amount of information that's out there, put it into some batch processing system and expect a report that can just be used and hand over to an engineer, planner, or policymaker. It's not so straightforward. And so the key components is when we think about a climate science assessment, we are keeping in mind, what are we talking about in terms of vulnerabilities? Vulnerabilities and opportunities. Vulnerability of what, to what, and when. So those are some components I wanted to share. That's a best practice model that is done by Amy Snova from University of Washington that I wanted to share as one example. And we recognize there's lots of expertise. There's subject matter expertise up and down the entire spectrum of how do you go from data analysis and into this decision context. So where are we today with this particular effort? And how does what we produce fit into the broader context? So very simply, if you take a linear approach, which we know it's not, the first component is let's frame the issue. So from the climate science assessment perspective, the first question was, with all the department and cabinet designees that Shushma wonderfully identified for us at the last meeting, we asked them before the meeting, consider all the programs, assets, activities that are of high priority or most significant. Think about the history of what's been occurring in terms of impacts and opportunities, and consider the decisions that are at stake, legal, economic, and social. And based on those components, what are the space and time dimensions associated with all of those decisions? And it's a lot. And then bring that back so that we can think about what are the science pieces that connect to it. Where do we have the state of the knowledge? Where do we already have the information? Where do we need to produce the information? And if we do not have it, can we find a way to do it? So those are the questions we were exploring over the last couple of weeks. So for example, we know today that as part of the national activities, we have produced state summaries. North Carolina state summaries were available for the 2014, up to 2014 period. Because of our recent engagement with DEQ, we have also been able to produce some initial analysis going up to 2018. So the charts that Adam showed are, fairly recent in the last 4 to 6 weeks. But the question from our team was, if these are all the data and the information that we have available today, it may or may not necessarily be representative of the decision context of the assets and the decisions that are of interest to North Carolina. So what is of interest to North Carolina was the first question. And you might think about, how do we propose that to the folks that we had in the room on April 8th? How have the specific programs been impacted? How do you see it affecting your programs, decisions, policies, so on and so forth? Think about it in the context of human systems, natural systems, infrastructure, social systems, economy, and policies. So the question was, what space and time scale matters? And does the current information give enough? In other words, what if, is what we're making available sufficient? And we don't know. And that's part of the reason why engagement and this iterative engagement is so important. And the reality is, what matters to the Department of Commerce is very different than what matters to Department of Environmental Quality. And then when you just drill into each of these departments, there's so many sub-departments. Even when you think about agriculture, to distill the difference between livestock and crops, and the way climate parameters manifest into these different dimensions are different. And in addition to that, the priorities are different. So priorities and vulnerabilities. So where we are and what we have done today is something that we wanted to share. And then we'll talk about where we're going to go from here. There's the available science information. And I can get into the technical components of it. The chart that you can't read intentionally is a list of all the variables and all the data and all the analysis that can be done and is mostly readily done, in a sense. But that's something that we can help in terms of outputs of all those different variables. Our question is, when we look at the thresholds of extreme hot days, for North Carolina, we know for the coast, the number of extreme hot days, very hot days, might be defined by a different threshold than what's defined for the mountains. Do we need to produce one that says temperature greater than 100 degrees for the coast and then temperature greater than 85 degrees for the mountains, for example? We want to uncover what are these science information needs. So in March, when we started some of this iterative back and forth with Shushma and Tancred and the whole team, they gave us a list of initial stressors. We reconciled that list against what's currently available. And then in April, we had asked, again, with the cabinet designees, after kind of going through another version of this presentation, what other additional needs do you have? And push the conversation a little bit into, what do you envision the impacts to be? Because the understanding of the impacts also helps us provide some perspective on, actually, if we produce the science and the data and the information in this context, it might help further that impact analysis question. Again, it's an iterative dialogue. It was very helpful to get the raw notes from that meeting output that we have analyzed. So In this past, month, we have done a bit of a initial gap analysis based on what we would characterize as needs that were defined, information that's available, where do we have the state of the knowledge, where do we have some gaps. So what you don't see in red in this bottom chart right here for April are a series of areas that are highlighted in red. That means we need to investigate where and how can we produce that information. Is it possible? Can we see a signal from the physics side? Where within North Carolina have others actually done some of the research? Because not some of the more recent research is done within the academic institutions. So can we identify those scientists that we can pull into the process? And so that goes back to our identification of who are the folks that we're going to pull in and who is available and able to support. Fairly straightforward here. And that is where we are. We have a long journey ahead of us, and we have a good plan. I'm very pleased to say that our engagement has been very productive and helpful. And I'm also very pleased to share that we've been able to get, a good level of specific and helpful information to help develop some of the science aspects piece of it. I would be remiss if I didn't go back to this chart as one of my key concluding messages that, the journey is long. And I commend North Carolina for taking this step. Thank you. Are we staying? We're staying.
We actually have a few minutes. If any of the council designees have questions for our panel, I can bring you the microphone if you'd like to ask a question of the panel. Chairman.
Adam, could you clarify the high emission scenarios? How would you characterize that? Is that a business as usual scenario or something different? Chris, could you?
Yeah, so I mean, the emission scenarios that we use through the National Climate Assessment span a range from, very, very aggressive mitigation to basically a business as usual kind of scenario. And so the National Climate Assessment, now these were developed internationally, so they're global emission scenarios because that's what influences global climate. And they were developed without any sort of probabilities associated with them. So not saying, this is a more likely scenario, this is a less likely scenario. They're just intended to be illustrative of certain pathways into the future. And so they're not taking into account policies like, let's say we implemented all of the agreements, at the Paris 2015 climate conference. So yes, the highest scenario has typically been interpreted as a sort of business usual scenario that happens to be roughly the scenario that we're tracking on right now.
Are there any other questions before I ask mine? Okay. So Jenny, you may not be able to answer this question, but it's something for you all to ponder at, and that is some idea of a schedule or a timeline. If you're able to share, that's good. If not, that way the council designees have an idea of what they're expected to do in the coming months.
So that is something that we will work with you specifically in terms of, there's a draft report timeline that we will be tracking to. Can we backtrack based on that draft date where you envision some of the impact activities to begin and at what point? So in my mind, I see, one, some of this information is already available. The second piece is, where do we need to fill in the blanks, where and how? Then we need to discuss, in terms of the how, what type of report or assessment would be most beneficial. We ask these questions simply because, from the national level, our experience has been one thing. So which framework are we going to develop is largely driven by what the team here would want to see. And based on what that looks like, we will have to iterate back and forth. So some of the North Carolina State Summaries information is available. I think once we have a little bit of an agreement from the designated cabinet members and other stakeholders on what other specific needs there are, what does that analysis look like? And based on complexity and our team's availability. So in some sense, we would probably look a little bit to you for guidance in terms of, what are the other interdependencies associated with this information, with other activities being started. We are aware of the bigger, broader timeline that you have laid out. And in that sense, the climate science assessment piece is, one upfront component of it. If we need to develop new and different science, then we will probably need to have a discussion. So vague, but not really. Little reticent to promise.
Understood. Thank you. And we know there are a lot of moving pieces.
First of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you for the work you're already doing to help us in our endeavor. Adam, you spoke to in the southeastern assessment, the southeast sticks out a little bit in terms of the temperature changes, and you said there were some theories. Can you share what some of those theories are as to why the southeast is different?
Sure. So, basically it breaks down to it could be related to pollution, or it could be related to reforestation, particularly pine forests. They release volatile organic compounds that then can block some solar radiation. And is there one I'm missing, or is that pretty much covers it? And then just natural variability in the climate system. So things like what we call teleconnections. So similar to like El Nino, you've heard of El Nino, but other things like North Atlantic oscillation that, or Pacific decadal oscillation that might be affecting just luck of the draw that we had some cooler temperatures in parts of the southeast, not across the entire southeast.
Yeah, and most likely it's kind of all of those things together, but that's also, that sort of warming hole that you see, that kind of flat trend, that's really apparent when you do a very long-term average, back to the beginning of the century. If you just look at the last few decades, the southeast is kind of, is sort of ticking back into where the rest of the country is in terms of expected warming.
Thank you.
All right, thank you guys so much. Ginny, you mentioned in what parts of the presentation about the importance of having usable information as a result of these assessments. I was wondering if you or any of you could speak to, I guess, when we think about what this assessment, and maybe it's more once you get into step 2 or goal 2 or 3 of the risk assessment portion, but in terms of communicating, the complexity of these global systems and downscaling and what that means in terms of impacts for not only the decision makers at the local level, but also the general public who will be interested in this report. I know there's some work. I guess I'm curious if you've seen good examples from maybe other states or in other parts of the country where, communicating that risk. I think, for example, of a graphic showing, flood levels, not just showing the numbers, but showing them next to, a graphic of a person knee deep, waist deep, enough to get your car floating, that sort of thing. I'm just curious if you guys have any thoughts on that or experience in translating the science into actionable information.
Yeah, thank you for that question. A lot of this is actually being discussed at the National Adaptation Forum occurring now. So Jessica Whitehead is there, literally getting some of the best practices. And she herself is an adaptation expert and specialist. So we have the team, DEQ has, excellent set of resources. I have a folder that I have prepared for Tancred and Shushma that is basically, examples of best practices. I haven't inundated them with them, but, there's things and examples of reports and methods that have worked well. So, for example, California, Oregon, New York, at the state level. At the other examples are, what's been done for the city of Raleigh, what's been done for the city of Charleston, Miami, Asheville, New York. Those are all, examples of how information has been communicated. Arguably, how complex global climate model information has been simplified. Do we use that word? Distilled into information that can be understood by the general public and also the decision makers. At NKICS, we leverage our expertise from the climate communications team extensively, because from my experience, that climate communication piece is its own expertise. And we have folks like, Susan Hassel, and we're lucky that we have the NOAA NCEI expertise and experience to pull from. That's just to give a short list. Visualization is a very important component of that communication that matters. We shared lots of graphs and charts, and they're technical and hard to understand, hard to read, unless they're really put into a context, either in a decision or how to translate that chart into something that's understandable is something that we spend a lot of time on. I know the National Climate Assessment team also has a lot of perspective on communication and visualization. At the end of the day, a lot of this will be driven from, in North Carolina, from either the advisory team, the engagement with the general public, and the feedback back from the general public. So we'll have to work on this, and there'll be some best practices that we can pull from, but we might have to develop some of our own. So in that context, that's an invitation for, the department and cabinet members to weigh in on what would work best for their stakeholders.
I appreciate my understanding from your presentation, and I've heard Richard Moss talk about this, that the inclination for the National Climate Assessment to be more for an audience not of just scientists, but also for policymakers and the public, and that's like a big shift, like you mentioned in the beginning, Chris. So want to recognize that. I think it's really effective. My question is, are you aware of efforts by National Climate Assessment authors or others to work with other states to help kind of downscale the information like you all talked about for North Carolina? Are other states asking for similar things? And if so, I'm sure we would be interested in lessons learned you just mentioned as far as communication, but I'm sure there are other aspects that we might be able to borrow best practices from other states. But if you could give us a larger context of, are there other states asking for downscaling this information to their particular localities?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, absolutely yes. And I mean, I know of a few examples off the bat. I mean, there's, folks involved with US GCRP and National Climate Assessment recently helped the state of Montana do a state level climate assessment. There's been long-standing kind of back and forth between US GCRP and state of California. State of California is one of the biggest. New York State and New York City, the state of New Jersey. I mean, I'm just thinking of things that I've been involved in. There's like the South Florida has a sort of major kind of inter-local government climate compact, basically focusing primarily on sea level rise and coastal issues that have done a lot of work with National Climate Assessment folks. And I think one of the strengths of, the National Climate Assessment process, at least the way that it's been built up over the last few years, is that it's really the expertise that's being drawn upon for the National Climate Assessment is really distributed nationally. So, these are experts that are situated in their own, institutions and, basically like every state in the country. And so they, a lot of times after the National Climate Assessment is done, they're the go-to people, just like you're seeing here with North Carolina, who's here in the state that has participated in this kind of process that is available, can be leveraged. So I think, North Carolina has been, particularly with this executive order, I think has been pretty forward-looking and has invested, a lot of thought and energy into creating something maybe a little more extensive than some of what I've seen, in other states across the country. But I would say the general ask is happening from most places.
Just to add that, as we produce the North Carolina state summaries, those state summaries are available for all the other states. So just rewind your question a little bit back to the National Climate Assessment 3 that resulted into that same requirement that came out of the White House for the NCIC's TSU team to produce state summaries. So, we are seeing the outcome of what's been requested. So that's, I guess, a circuitous way of saying we have produced analysis for all 50 states, and we will do we're in the process of producing the newer versions of the state summaries as we speak. We just bumped up North Carolina.
I just want to add my thanks to you all for the time and expertise that you're donating to this effort. It's really appreciated. One question I have, Jenny, you're leading this process of trying to get the agencies to give you these key, thresholds or tipping points, whatever it is. What's most important to each agency? I'm wondering if there's a similar process done at the national level to get from the states, I guess, or the regions. What are those key thresholds? Trying to simplify your work maybe in saying, maybe we don't know the answers to those questions. We gave you some initial input, but maybe you don't know fully what those answers are. And maybe what's more or easier is what are the trends? What are we seeing and projecting just as the trends in these different stressors?
So when it's a very interesting question, and I would probably want to call Ken Kunkel on this one, but I have members of the US GCRP team here. The definition of the science components that have been analyzed in the CSSSR, it's an extraordinary list of experts, both on the physical science side, but those that understand what defines heat stroke, those that define vulnerabilities and thresholds. So I would say the scientific literature has, of course, been leveraged in defining the initial perspective of those thresholds at the national level. That's probably the safest way to answer that. But.
Well, just one other thing to add to that, and that's right, is that under each of the federal agencies, I guess back in 2013, 2014, were required under executive order, forget what it was, 13654, something like that, to produce adaptation plans that basically, so the federal agencies, to a certain degree, they map onto some, analogous functions to the state agencies to produce adaptation plans that basically looked at their missions, at their kind of organic missions, what were kind of their major functions, which ones of those functions were facing which sort of risks from climate change, and reported back basically to this interagency council at the federal level. And there's a wealth of information in those agency adaptation plans that might, and I would say they're all still available somewhere. You can dig them up somewhere on the web. A lot of the agencies have them, but US GCRP itself, its globalchange.gov website has a portal to all of the agency adaptation plans. And so it might be worth it, to just look through, what does the Federal Department of Transportation say, or sort of the major vulnerabilities, and those adaptation plans also explicitly referred back to the National Climate Assessment, those findings, and tried to kind of weave those two pieces together. So that might help.
So what you're seeing there is sort of like two sides of a model. Is one is sort of like looking at the agency level missions, right? And that can be a way to sort of elicit what are the most important, the fundamental objectives, or the fundamental objectives that speak to the fundamental values that agency has to address, right? And those should then map to things that North Carolinians care about, right? The other flip side of that is sort of what we did in the Southeast chapter, where we didn't just go, agency by agency. It was a strictly bottom-up approach in terms of communicating with the public, but then also, either canvassing the literature, using our own expertise, talking to other experts in terms of trying to formulate what are the things that are make this, in our case, the Southeast unique, and what is valued there. And sometimes you just have to go for it and make that call, I think, and then get feedback. That's why it's iterative, and say, did we get this right? Does this make sense to you? And what did we miss? And I think that's really important in terms of being able to speak to those values, so then you know which sort of science is most salient to addressing the risks that the state faces.
Absolutely. And to kind of take it up even slightly at a higher level or a different level is, certain components of the thresholds have been defined by standards that have been established by, let's say, the World Meteorological Organization. For the heat index, we leveraged and sourced the National Weather Service's definition of what defines a heat index. If you ask where did they come up with that, that goes right back to the science and the scientific experts that have done some of the analysis. So you take, that information, and for the engineers, a lot of that information is in the engineering handbooks, the standards and so on and so forth that have already been defined that tell you what those thresholds are. But you've got to reconcile that with the engagement and the iterative engagement, and ask the question, how has this changed? What recent scenario, incident, situation has occurred where you might envision a change in that threshold? Is that the right, and we've got to uncover these questions, and this is why this conversation is so iterative.
I'm just going to say, but even that speaks to a value if you walk it back. And so in terms of heat stress, what does that speak to? That speaks to health effects, and the value there, probably the objective is minimize loss of life, right, due to heat stress. So that's then speaking to a basic value that we share.
So Jenny, Adam, and Chris, in closing, I'd like to thank you. And please take our sincere gratitude from the department and all the cabinet agencies and the governor's office for the help you're providing us. We know that you embraced this ask couple of weeks ago, and we struggled through what is it that we're trying to do. And we have a lot of questions to ask still, and we are thankful for the guidance and for bringing your success stories to North Carolina. We will be there with you. And in that response, I'd like to extend my ask to my colleagues at the other cabinet agencies to be responsive, to be alert, to be part of this process. They are looking for input and guidance from us as much as we are. So we owe it to ourselves and them and the state to be proactive, responsive, and creative towards meeting the goals of the executive order. And my vision is that in the coming meetings of the council, we will be able to provide some regular updates, but the public that's interested will be putting updates on our website for upcoming engagements with the outside external stakeholders and where we are in the process. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
So by my watch, it's 11:07. We're going to take a 10-minute break. If everyone could be back at 11:17. A reminder, if you'd like to make an oral comment during the public engagement section, to please sign up at the registration table. Thank you.
give you all a flavor of the kind of actions and the kind of activities that can be implemented in the natural and working lands area that relates to what you learned about in the first part of this this day. And the reason we started working with the natural working lands is this is one area that, as Adam mentioned earlier, that mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, meaning that reduction of emissions, is an important aspect to addressing climate change. But while those emissions are occurring, adapting and creating resiliency to those emissions impacts is also important. In the world of natural and working lands, you can actually attack both mitigation as well as resiliency and adaptation. So the speakers we have today are going to talk about the stakeholder process that we started even before Executive Order 80 came out, but it has evolved, and they are working towards creating work products that would help the agencies and the local communities, but also build into the report itself. In various studies across the country and across the globe, nature-based solutions, or what we call natural climate solutions, have been identified as one of the best assets we have towards addressing climate change. And I hope that you get a feel for why this is so important. Leading off would be Dr. Lydia Olander, and pardon me if I botched your last name. Lydia directs the Ecosystem Services Program at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University. She's an adjunct associate professor at the Nicholas School of the Environment. She also leads the National Ecosystem Services Partnership. In that role, she integrates ecosystem services into decision-making and studies environmental markets and mitigation. She also serves on the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Environmental Advisory Board and is also serving as the secretariat of the Bridge Collaborative. Thank you, Lydia. Next, we'll have Paula Hemmer. Paula is one of our own. She's a senior environmental engineer with DEQ's Division of Air Quality. Paula supports emissions forecasting and inventory efforts related to air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And Paula is a key contributor to agencies' emissions and energy modeling activities. Thank you, Paula. And then next we have Dr. Sarah Ward. Dr. Ward is ecologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service based in Manio. She has worked on the carbon sequestration benefits of about 30,000-acre peatland restoration project at Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. She provides technical support to the Nature Conservancy and partners in development of greenhouse gas methodology. Their team has prepared the accounting for the GHG benefits of Pocosin restoration, and she's going to be talking about that. Sarah also co-chairs the Natural and Working Lands Pocosin's Wetland Stakeholder Group that I mentioned earlier. And then last but not least, Will McDowell is the Director of Resilient Landscapes with Environmental Defense Fund. Will leads the development and implementation of EDF's Landscape Resilience Initiative. He engages communities, farmers, and other stakeholders to develop shared solutions to support the viability and productivity and health of natural and human communities to a changing climate. So in the next hour, you will hear a lot about natural and working lands. So Lydia, please come to the podium.
Well, it's an honor to be here and to talk about this Natural and Working Lands group. I'm trying to introduce the idea of this group and what we're trying to do and who's involved a little bit. The big picture is that natural and working lands, agriculture, forestry, and coastal habitats in North Carolina can provide significant opportunities to support the state's climate goals and to provide greater resilience from future storms and other events, helping to reduce things like flooding, water quality impairments, and coastal erosion. So what I'll cover in this talk is I'll very briefly talk about how natural and working lands can contribute to the state's carbon reduction goals. Then I'll show some detail on what this looks like for forest, agriculture, and coastal habitats, and then an overview of the Natural and Working Lands Working Group that's been convened by Department of Environmental Quality and the Governor's Office, and highlight some of the work of these groups, and then a timeline of what we're trying to produce. So just briefly, looking at the inventory for the state, looking at the bar on the left, the inventory estimates that under business as usual trends, we can get to about 104 million metric tons, which is well on our way to 91 million metric ton goals. And you'll notice that the natural and working lands contribution is pretty large. There's a net carbon sink from natural and working lands that's around 34 million metric tons. So it's a really important piece contributing to our goals. And the other bar shows a very, very rough assessment, probably an underestimate of what we could get if we put more effort into our natural working lands, something on the order of 10 or more million metric tons per year. Very rough assumptions if we kind of move forward aggressively on doing work on our natural and working lands. So the results in the next few slides are from the North Carolina Opportunities Assessment, which is a top-down assessment and not fully ground truth, so initial estimates. And this is for forests in North Carolina, and it shows the potential to enhance carbon storage in North Carolina forests from various management activities, and these are also in millions of metric tons of CO2 equivalents per year. And if you look at it, it shows different kinds of reforestation for various types of lands and activities, things like riparian buffers in urban areas and pastures, wetlands, and croplands, but also other, which includes things like rights of way and under power lines and roadsides, post-forest burn areas, golf courses, et cetera. And then there's also carbon management on existing forested lands by increasing stock in those forests. So those are all different kinds of activities we could do to enhance carbon storage. And the green inset is from the U.S. Forest Service, and it shows that in North Carolina, most of the forest is on private lands, which suggests the need to maintain strong markets and incentives for private forest lands to maintain our current carbon sequestration and enhance that. Here we can see that this is a number of states that are involved in the Climate Alliance, and North Carolina is listed here, and it is one of the top states, tied for number 3, in terms of the amount of carbon it is storing every year in its forests. And urban trees are contributing significantly in the region. So we need to try to maintain these kinds of trends. Here's agriculture. So the potential to enhance carbon storage in North Carolina lands includes things like managing existing croplands, so cover crops and nutrient management activities, planting trees on parts of existing agricultural lands like windbreaks and silvopastoral activities, and keeping more agricultural lands in grasslands and pasture lands instead of croplands, and also maybe avoiding grassland conversion and loss. And then if we move to our coastal systems here in North Carolina, we have salt marsh and seagrass, both systems that store carbon in their soil and in their vegetation. And we use some estimates that currently exist for the extent of these habitats, combine these with estimates of carbon storage in these types of habitats. And we estimate that the rate of carbon sequestration, or the burial rate, for existing or restored coastal habitats would be almost about 0.7 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year for salt marsh, and only about 0.1 for seagrass. So that's a significant amount per year to be adding to these systems. And then when we look at the total amount currently stored in salt marshes that has been accumulating over time, it's around 125 million tons of CO2 equivalents for North Carolina coasts. And for seagrass, it's about 15 million tons of CO2 equivalents. However, much of this existing carbon that is stored in these systems is being lost as these coastal areas are rapidly developing. So conservation of these existing habitats is really important to avoid such losses. And we also need restoration to gain additional carbon sequestration in these systems. And I just want to note that I'm starting to carry forward kind of the largest bar or the numbers from the previous slides, just so you can kind of keep track on order of magnitude and how they compare to one another. So another thing in the coastal systems is that tidal marshes in many places now have restrictive flow, and that reduces salinity. And this causes greater release of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, in these marshes. And if we could restore the natural flows to these systems, that could reduce these methane emissions. And this could be equivalent to about 500,000 metric tons of CO2 storage per year if we did that. So that just gives you a sense of what we can do across all these systems, the orders of magnitudes and the types of activities. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Natural and Working Lands Group. Given the significant opportunities in natural and working lands for carbon storage to help the state reach its goals, the Governor's Office and the Department of Environmental Quality invited interested agencies and organizations across the state to participate in discussions about how to prioritize and engage natural and working lands in activities that reduce carbon and enhance carbon sequestration and storage. And that group now has 40 to 50 experts from different organizations from a very wide range, NGOs, academic institutions, state and federal agencies. And given the significant impact of the last year's storms, the group was really interested in understanding not only the carbon opportunities, but also the potential resilience benefits. Many of these habitats could potentially provide significant benefits by reducing flooding, providing water quality improvements, and potentially reducing wildfire in some cases. So the group is now working to better understand and estimate the resilience benefits that we could get from some of these natural and working lands habitats and activities, and then develop a plan to kind of put together the resilience and the carbon information to figure out which habitats to target and to understand which existing programs and funding sources and potentially some new ideas that could help us move forward in working on natural and working lands. We have broken into a number of subgroups to kind of dive in to these details. So we have a group on floodplains and wetlands, one on Pocosin wetlands, coastal habitats, looking at this blue carbon opportunity, agricultural, forestry, and urban systems, and then kind of a cross-cutting effort to try to understand the financing and programs, which will be somewhat the same across these different groups. 3 of these groups are digging in to try to look at the resilience benefits in more detail and try to estimate them. One is the floodplains and wetlands group. Another is Pocosin wetlands, which we'll hear about a little bit in a moment, and the coastal habitats. So I'm just going to give a little sense of what this looks like. So this is a map of river flooding vulnerability, a map for North Carolina. And this includes things like places where wetlands and floodplains can be protected or restored upstream of vulnerable areas is what we're trying to understand. And this is a map zoomed into 2 places, Crabtree Valley Mall in Raleigh, and this experiences frequent flooding from Crabtree Creek. And on the right side, this is the city of Kinston over here, and is vulnerable to flooding from the Neuse River. And so we're using this as a part of the layers we're looking at, and this is kind of vulnerability of different communities to flooding, and it's one of the layers that we'll be including in this assessment. Flooding is complex and depends on a lot of different factors, so it's difficult to make a general natural working lands on flooding. So our approach here is to do an opportunities assessment. We'll be looking at active kind of where the river currently floods and how that land is protected and what the opportunities might be for conservation and restoration on those lands. Also look at wetlands. And we'll overlay these vulnerability maps like this one with things like land ownership and carbon and other opportunities to try to target where best to act. And we will be using estimates from the literature and case studies to try to quantify the flood and water quality benefits that are possible. And then we're going to hear a talk in just a moment from Dr. Sarah Ward about the Pocosins. These coastal wetlands systems are currently not included in our kind of overall assessment of what natural working lands can provide, and there's significant opportunity in these systems to increase carbon sequestration, and there are also potentially a lot of resilience benefits. When we restore these systems, they raise up the land, and so they reduce flooding in areas that are downstream. They can also, because they're more consistently wetted when they're restored, reduce the wildfire risk and smoke exposure around those fires. So that's an opportunity that's worth pursuing. For coastal habitats, can do an assessment of resilience benefits from coastal habitats. We're using some existing models and adapting them. And this is an index of coastal vulnerability to coastal storms, and it incorporates information on the kind of shape of the shoreline, historic wind and wave conditions, storm surge potential, so a lot of these other factors, but then it overlays coastal habitats that could provide protection by reducing wave height and reducing shoreline erosion. And so what we're looking at is how much habitats can contribute to reducing vulnerability in these coastal systems. And we're then overlay this with the carbon opportunities to try to target places to work. And so the left frame Over here is the vulnerability index, and the most vulnerable are the darker. In the middle here, we have habitat's role in reducing that vulnerability. So the dark green is where habitats are playing the biggest role. And then over here is salt marsh and seagrass. So this green one includes sand dunes and such, which don't store a lot of carbon. So when we take those out, we get this purple, which focuses in on the habitats that reduce vulnerability from storms, but also provide carbon benefits. And then just to dive in so you can see this in a little more detail, this is zoomed into Alligator River Inlet. The left frame shows those vulnerable, the middle frame shows the all the coastal habitats, and the right frame shows the seagrass and salt marsh. So these, all these areas, so we have seagrass in purple, coastal forest in dark green, and emergent marsh in light green. So all those areas up there would be targets for both opportunities. And so what we see too is that this particularly seems important along the inlets. So that's just an example of some of the work we're doing to understand the resilience opportunities that will overlap with carbon. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the findings from some of the other groups. So the Urban Lands Group has been thinking a lot about the activities that might contribute from urban systems, so things like reducing or eliminating food waste and using that in food banks or for compost. Floodplains buyouts and restoration, increasing urban tree canopy and green spaces, and increasing green infrastructure that have the same benefits of trees in terms of reducing heat island effect and storing carbon, but also provide stormwater benefits. And then there have been a couple different groups, both the forestry group and the finance group, digging in to try to understand what are the opportunities for programs and funding to support this kind of activity, both on public and private lands. And so we have activities that are tax incentives or program incentives that could be used, things like reinstating the conservation tax credit, establishing separate climate resilient trust fund, increasing funding and streamlining agricultural development and farmland preservation. So those are all public lands opportunities. And then on private lands, things like expanding funding opportunities for North Carolina Forest Development Program, expand present use valuation program to industrial lands, expand wildlife conservation program tax for non-timber forest products and carbon benefits, and maybe develop some programs related to carbon specifically, so incentives, trading, offsets, and other such things. And there's also potentially educational opportunities that could help, things like developing programs for forest adaptive management strategies, developing estate planning sessions to promote land retention in the current community, especially for smaller forest landowners. And then maybe there's other resources we could look to, like ballot funding initiatives or Department of Defense funding opportunities. And there are also some grant opportunities we could look to. For the federal program, there's the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program from FEMA and Conservation Innovation Grants from NRCS. There's a lot of funding right now for recovery from Hurricane Florence and the storm Michael. And so there may be opportunities to focus some of those resources towards natural and working lands investments that may help enhance resiliency in the future. That might be a wise investment to consider. And then in private finance, we have things like voluntary carbon markets and urban tree planting programs. And then I've also heard recently about people talking about engaging the insurance industry in investments in blue carbon and coastal green infrastructure that would help protect coasts. And so there's lots of interesting ideas to consider there. And finally, the timing of what we're trying to do. So right now, these subgroups have been working independently, trying to dig in and figure out what we can figure out about resilience benefits, refine carbon estimates, and explore what kinds of programs and financing is available. We're going to pull that out all together and hopefully have draft results in August, and then turn that into an action plan in November, and then finalize that in January of 2020, and then hopefully have a long-term action plan in September. So that's it. Thank you. Next.
Should we stop? Should we wait for questions, I think, right? Hi, I'm Paula Hemmer. I have to raise this up because I'm a tall person. I'm Paula Hemmer. I'm with the Division of Air Quality, and I worked on the natural and working lands inventory, and this was part of our greenhouse gas inventory. So if you haven't taken a look at it, please go and it's easy to find. Just look up North Carolina greenhouse gas inventory and you'll get it right on the web. The purpose of inventories in general is they hold a large purpose in trying to develop action plans. So for natural and working lands, this is especially true because there is less understanding of the scientific aspects of each source and sink. For example, fuel use is pretty simple. You use an amount of fuel, it gives off an amount of carbon. So it's not quite as straightforward as some of our other sectors. In addition, you can use these inventories to help you estimate the impact of various activities, and then what are the key aspects of the activities and trends over the over long periods of time. For our inventory, I think we learned a lot about North Carolina forests and how they are growing and supporting carbon sequestration in the state. And as you've just heard from Lydia, we're using our inventory to develop mitigation options and determine the carbon sequestration in various sectors of natural and working lands. We also hope to use this information to help us choose cost-effective mitigation actions that we can implement, and to eventually measure change over time with the impact of our actions on the natural and working lands. So if you can't measure it, you can't understand how it's growing or changing in the state. And lastly, if we find these we define these measurement mechanisms, we can potentially use these, as Lydia mentioned, to obtain financing as carbon offsets. I think I want to say also that the action plan and the inventory sort of feed each other. As the action plan gets built, it will influence the inventory, and as the inventory gets more refined, it will potentially influence what actions we begin to implement. This slide, I think, has been shown a lot, and I just want to point out that natural and working lands is a key sector, both the agriculture part and the land use and land use changes part. Agriculture is the 4th largest emitter in the state, and natural and working land use and land use changes is sequestering approximately 34 million metric tons each year. There are various activities that go into the inventory. These include carbon flux from forest management, urban and rural sediments, and landfill yard and food waste. And then there are also emissions activities, including fertilization and liming of soils, forest fires, and of course we discussed agriculture as a major contributor. I want to go briefly through what carbon flux is. It is the net change in carbon from year to year. So these carbon fluxes occur from clearing an area of forest to create cropland, from restocking a logged forest, allowing a pasture to revert to grassland, and a number of other things. One of the things that people don't think about is the long-term storage of carbon in lumber and other wood products. How do we estimate these emissions? DAQ utilized readily available tools and data sets. So we primarily relied on the US EPA state inventory tool, the SIT, and that's discussed a lot in the GHG inventory report. This method was downscaled to the state level where possible, and for natural and working lands that was a much more difficult process, and we were not able to get all of our sectors estimated. So we have a lot of holes in this area, and we hope to fill them in over the coming years. Hopefully some of the group that's in the natural and working lands sector I can rope into helping me making this a more robust inventory. They don't know about that yet, though. So next we have the forest carbon flux that was estimated using very sophisticated tools from the Forest Inventory Analysis Group at USDA. And the data sets we used were readily available federal data downscaled to North Carolina. And a lot of this data came from, for us, the forestry data came from the North Carolina Forestry Service surveys that they conduct each year. So like I said, where we had no federal data, we obtained state data where we could, like some of the forest fire data that we had and prescribed burning data is from the state. And the forest carbon flux data we'll talk about a little bit because everybody's very interested in that. It uses both federal remote imagery data and North Carolina Forest Service plot level forest attribute data, such as tree diameter, and North Carolina Forest Service forest health data. One thing I want to point out is that it's very difficult challenging to quantify this sector, and the challenge is quantifying anthropogenic changes versus just changes in general. So another important aspect of this is that US EPA, where we get a lot of our tools and data from, is reporting emissions to the IPCC to meet international agreements. Therefore, they use the 2006 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change guidelines for greenhouse gases, and therefore, by default, we are using most of those methods as well. So here is the forest carbon stock data. So this is how much carbon we have in forests. And it's based on a 5-year survey cycle, which we just recently completed for North Carolina, using new tools and statistical tools. So this is the best set of data that we could possibly have right now this year. So we got very lucky in the timing of our publishing of this inventory. This represents the net forest carbon stocks. So it's already taking pluses and minuses at this point. And at the bottom, we have our forest area and how it's changing. So we have above ground biomass and below ground biomass, deadwood, litter, and soil organic carbon. And you can see that the largest increases over time are from above ground and below ground biomass. And here sort of sums everything up, where we have a 13% increase in our carbon stocks, while we're only growing our forest area by about 2%, and that's from the very excellent forest management services we have going on. And I want to also note that this is both public and private forest lands, so state forests, national forests, and privately owned forests. And you can see that this is sort of the slope of the line, and what we're doing by measuring carbon flux is we're sort of measuring that delta, year-to-year delta. It's not the actual forest carbon that's available, it's the change that we're measuring. So here is the actual land use inventory where we have the forest carbon flux. And you can see that it is not changing that much, even though we have this growth happening, and that's because it's the year-to-year change, not the total. All right, I hope that straightens that out a bit. Lots of people have been confused by this. So then you can see this is an interesting part of it. It's the stored wood products. This is an area where we need to do a little work. North Carolina has done pretty good at assessing wood products and harvesting wood and where it goes, the carbon pool, as you call it. And then you can see how this sector is dominating North Carolina's inventory at this point. But we still have a lot of holes to address, obviously. These are emissions down here, and you can see here's the forest fire data. This data is less robust than later years, and this combines both federal and state data. So here's our final bottom line here, our net sink, and here you can see your emissions. So one thing I want to point out is the wood used for combustion in the state, specifically the word pelletization. And what happens is the wood is in this biomass, above ground and below ground biomass, the tree is removed and it gets moved from this section down to this section unless it is used for combustion. At this point, if it's used for combustion, it completely gets taken out. So it is essentially zeroed out of the inventory, and it does not enter the long-term storage pool. And that's how we account for the carbon in wood that is combusted. And this can be wood that is combusted outside of the state as well as inside of the state. All right, so you heard a lot from Lydia about how we can use the various sectors to sequester carbon. This sort of lays them all out. She laid them out individually. And so this is from a similar source, the opportunity assessment that was done by the U.S. Climate Alliance. They also did it by dollar per ton of carbon removed, which is how engineers think about it. So, and for me, this, as an engineer, this tells me that we can stack a few of these pathways, like Lydia talked about, to get to about 10 or 11 metric tons of carbon, or CO2e, and get about a 10% reduction in net GHGs for North Carolina, in addition to what it's already doing. And I think that says a lot for what we can accomplish in the state. And I want to also point out that you have no feel for how large this sector is. North Carolina has 19 million acres of public and private forests. We have about 8 million acres of agricultural land. A lot of it is located on the coast, and that means North Carolina has about 87% of its land mass in natural and working lands. So that's a significant amount of land. And I think that's it. I think I'm done. Happy Arbor Day. All right, and we'll go on to Sarah. And I want to point out that Sarah's, the aspects that Sarah are going to discuss are not in the inventory because it's less understood, and it's going to be a challenge to incorporate all this into the inventory for us. So.
Great. Well, thank you for the invitation to be here today, and I really appreciate and am grateful for the state's interest in looking to natural and working lands as a solution to climate change. It's something that the Fish and Wildlife Service has been focused on for quite some time now, and it's really an exciting time to be working with the state on these issues. So today I'm really going to focus on some key points and some key takeaways. I think what we've heard today is that there are a variety of sectors within the natural and working lands landscape that provides some benefit. Precosins, we're going to take a bit of a deeper dive. Some of you may not even be aware of what a precosin is, but they provide a whole lot of carbon. I've heard folks talk about them almost like pre-coal in terms of the amount of carbon that's sequestered below the ground surface. So they really can help meet the state's climate and resiliency goals while delivering a lot of co-benefits that are important because they're a globally important habitat type. One of the attractive aspects of them for this purpose is there's already been a scientific-based standard process developed to quantify and verify these carbon benefits, in part because of the interest in precosins over the past decade. We've heard loud and clear that this protocol was needed, so we've worked with partners to generate it. There are available resources both from a financing standpoint and an expertise and partnering and leverage standpoint that can help grow these opportunities in the state, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll just briefly touch on some of the additional measures that the Natural and Working Land subgroup is considering that kind of give us even more bang for the buck in terms of resiliency and carbon sequestration capacity. So what are they? I'm going to just touch on this really quick. They're right under our noses, and some of us don't know they're there. They're a fire-dependent system, so we're not talking about preventing wildfire on the landscape. They are essentially a swamp on the hill. It's a peat bog that grows over time, geologic time, into a hill on the landscape. They sequester a lot of carbon. These thick peat soils act as a sponge for carbon over time. And that sponge is so important because it's the sink for greenhouse gases, but when they're drained, it becomes the source. This peat depth extends over 4 meters in some locations, so it's truly remarkable. Just in terms of how they work, this is an exaggerated description of those domes, but at the top of the dome, it's entirely fed by rainfall for the most part. And that rainfall then would, in a natural system, slowly dissipate out, ultimately reaching our coastal rivers. These are largely coastal plain habitats. And there's a large peat base underneath it that's underlined by this sand and mineral soil layer. But We've been really good in the past decades at doing a lot of drainage networks on our coastal plain. Those drainage networks typically cut through that peat base down into the sand lens, becomes effectively a bathtub drain on them, and so it's lowered the water table, and when that water table gets lowered, it releases the soil over time to the atmosphere, and that becomes a greenhouse gas source. So essentially, the restoration, the natural solution here is fixing the sponge, turning it back into what it wanted to be and sequestering that carbon back in the soil and preventing the future loss of carbon to the atmosphere. I mentioned that we're effective at the draining. The drainage has the problem for sure, but it also presents the nature-based solution. So this is an actionable solution that when you look at the extent of drainage networks on the coast of coastal Carolina and look at the opportunities where that overlaps with these Pocosin habitats is quite remarkable. I mentioned that slow loss of carbon to the atmosphere via soil oxidation. We also, and some of you will probably remember some of these fires, particularly in the 2008 timeframe, there were multiple peat fires burning in eastern North Carolina, and when the wind reversed, you could smell them here in the triangle. That was essentially just tons and tons of carbon going up into the atmosphere that was lost. It also comes at a other great cost. But, so this is the extensive ditch network. The area that I'm going to be talking about today is a National Wildlife Refuge out here. You can see how extensive the ditch network is there, and that became the foundation for the fix. So essentially what we're talking about today is taking that drain condition, putting it back into a restored condition where you can get the sink, the sponge is working again. Part of the service's interest in it, candidly, is we've been underfunded when it comes to restoring these landscapes that we have a lot of federal ownership of in eastern North Carolina. So we were looking for outside-of-the-box ways to attract more partners to our efforts to restore these lands. That's where I came in, helping to bring in the science to help address what the carbon benefits of these landscapes are. Because of the fires, this was the Evans Road fire in 2008, the land you see here was on the refuge. It was during a drought season, but we had already put the infrastructure in place for the restoration. It helps prevent that fire from burning the soil. The soil itself is the source. So when we think about wildfire, we often think about the trees and the shrubs burning above ground surface. Peatlands are so carbon rich that the fire goes below ground and it will keep burning for months because it's so dry and it's so meaningful. So that is really the challenge here, is getting water back in the soil to keep it in the ground rather than losing it to the atmosphere. And this is an example of one of those catastrophic losses. The ground surface would have been up here. You see all the rooted trees. It burned all of the organic peat soils all the way down to, this is that sand layer that I showed in that earlier diagram. So it's pretty significant loss. There was, in that one fire alone, up to 5 feet of peat loss in some areas. But it's much more than carbon sequestration. The Fish and Wildlife Service wouldn't be on the stage talking about it if it was just about carbon. We also are interested in it for the wildlife habitat benefits, but also the estuarine water quality benefits. When you put a great sponge on the landscape, it is essentially filtering out a lot of what's coming into via atmospheric deposition. So it protects estuarine water quality for that reason and provides quality water for nursery habitats. Conserves the peat, but most of our peatlands, in fact, all of our peatlands in eastern North Carolina are in places that are relatively vulnerable to sea level rise. Some of our low elevation peatlands are essentially providing the elevation in a place where we're constantly losing it or vulnerable to storm surge and other rising river levels. So basically, preserve the peat where you need it the most. Let's not be losing elevation in places that are most vulnerable. They reduce the frequency and intensity of the wildfires that I just mentioned by doing this type of work. Lessening the flooding from storms. When you look at those ditch networks, they essentially are the conduits for storm surge to surge further interior into the landscape. So when we fix these wetlands and make them back into sponges, it creates a situation where that water can't jet further inland than it otherwise would want to go, and that's pretty meaningful in these low-lying communities. Limit saltwater intrusion through that same mechanism. The other part of it too is these are freshwater rain systems that capture the rain and hold it in the sponge. By maintaining that freshwater head, you're repelling the effects of saltwater intrusion. So it really provides a protective mechanism. And then finally, the human community impacts. This is what the fire looked like from space when it was happening. It was smoking out the Outer Banks during the middle of the peak tourism season. Never a good thing, in addition to the carbon impacts. But then when that wind reversed and blew it this way, it was fairly significant. And what you know, the human community impacts, they did a post-fire assessment, retrospective assessment of emergency room visits with the folks over at EPA, and looked at not just in North Carolina, but also in the Tidewater region of Virginia, that the emergency room visits went up dramatically because the amount of particulate material and smoke coming off of these fires. So by fixing it, we're addressing community interests beyond just sea level rise and vulnerable elevation. And it's meaningful in terms of the climate scope. When you're talking about something that's so carbon rich as peat soils are, we're really looking at a significant climate impact by fixing them. So the climate impact is related to the work that we've done is that estimated at about 1,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per acre over a 100-year time frame. So peatlands in general don't compromise a large spatial footprint in North Carolina, but because of how carbon rich they are, they're significant as a stock to consider, and that's why our Natural and Working Lands Group really did, even though they are part of a coastal system, they're unique in their own right, and that we're kind of weaving them in because of that. They cover only 3% of the world's land area, but contain more than twice the carbon stock of forest biomass worldwide. 20 to 30% of the soil carbon is represented in peatlands, despite their spatial coverage. And that pool in the soil carbon pool with peatlands is roughly equivalent to overall atmospheric carbon dioxide. So in other words, they have great carbon sink potential, and it's meaningful for us to consider here in North Carolina. And you know, for our purposes, it really is this relationship between the carbon dioxide emissions from a drained peatland, and then when you start to bring up the water table, those emissions go down. And so this relationship becomes kind of a proxy for how you measure those benefits in peatlands. It's one mechanism of doing it anyway. But just speaking about, so positive climate impact and what is the scope in North Carolina, if there's not enough of it here to move the needle, we wouldn't be talking. So what you see here in purple are a representation of those peatlands that have historically been drained, that have some restoration potential based on our knowledge. But significantly, you look at the percentage of those highlighted here in kind of that aqua color, those are already in conservation ownership, meaning you don't even have to buy the land to put the fix in the landscape. And some of these lands are owned and managed by the state of North Carolina. So I understand you all have been charged with trying to offset your emissions. You already potentially own the lands on which you could be doing some of this, and it's a fairly cost-effective approach. So 42% in conservation. A lot of that is up here in the Albemarle Pamlico Peninsula, right here, Dare County Peninsula. This is Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. This is Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge, and we have a whole bunch of it up here in Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. So that's why we're keenly interested in it. We manage hundreds of thousands of acres of these lands. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Pocosin Lakes simply as an example of what's achievable potentially on landscapes elsewhere. So we have, as I pointed out before, a pretty good ditch network here that we've used the ditch network as the source of how we're restoring the landscape. I'm not going to get into talking about how we do it, but it's pretty low tech, pretty low cost, so that's the takeaway that you all need to know. But it has huge potential. So far we have restored about 30,000 acres of peatlands here at this refuge alone. To my knowledge, although Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge has given us a run for it, this is probably the largest peatland restoration of its type in eastern part of the U.S., barring the Everglades, which is a little bit of a different habitat type. But it's sequestered so far 32 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's an impressive amount of carbon. And as Paula had mentioned, it's not yet captured in kind of the inventory, but we have to think about how to do that because it's also a source. So the source is significant, but the potential for sequestration is very significant. So, but notably resources, when you all are thinking about how to take this to the landscape, we had heard and responded to what we had heard that this really needs to be a method where folks can get some carbon credits. It'll bring more players to the table, not just land managers, but also private investors, private landowners. So this is a recent methodology that was finalized that allows us, that has the stepwise progression of how you quantify and verify those carbon benefits on the landscape, and it applies to a broad range. Another resource is a proof of concept. So since that methodology has been finalized, we are doing a demonstration project. It really provides a roadmap for folks to tap into. I think the takeaway from here is that it really takes a village. Partners are available to help. There are lots of expertise in terms of available expertise, but also those partnerships help leverage resources to get it done. So it can see the number of folks who have been involved in making this 1,300-acre demonstration a reality. Financing is going to be particularly important when we talk about taking this to scale. The voluntary market, by having this new methodology in place, it really does allow folks to tap into a carbon crediting financing approach that provides an annual return. I did mention it's relatively low cost. We're talking about water control structures and levee construction for the most part, so it's not the most expensive type of restoration out there. The state has long noticed the importance of these and developed a BMP manual for it. There were lots of hydrologists who can help with this type of work. There's stacking opportunities. This is important. Most of the restoration cost is up front for these systems, so thinking about things like farm bill programs that allow for putting some of the infrastructure on the ground, coupled with some of these long-term return of carbon investment, can really make the complete package not just for landowners, but also for land managers. Government funding sources. I wanted to point out roughly 8,000 acres of the 30,000 acres at Pocosin Lakes was funded by the State Department of Environmental Quality, not as a carbon project, as something proactive in a nutrient-sensitive watershed to offset nutrient loads. But that was during the normal course of business. So if you think about it, a lot of what DEQ is already doing has a net carbon benefit that's not being counted for yet, but could be. So you could put a carbon number to what DEQ invested in at these wetlands, and that's meaningful. So it's something to challenge yourself to think about when you're trying to offset your agency footprint. There are federal sources of funding. DOD has been a huge partner on these types of projects for military preparedness. This gives capability. Putting water back on the landscape allows them not to have to shut down their training days because there's fire smoking out their training operations. So they've funded these restorations so that they can keep their pilots in the air. There's also an interest in keeping these eastern parts of the state dark for training purposes. So restoring wetlands, conserving wetlands allows for a financial incentive to help keep them in that manner. So that's another stacking resource. Grant funding's available, and then corporate interests are growing. Duke Energy funded, in part, the methodology development. Delta, with their changing requirements coming online, is going to be looking for types of credit. So I think there's lots of stacking opportunity here with future airline targets. And I did mention the cost of inaction is great. I just want to point out from a state perspective, state and federal agencies are coming to the mat to fight these fires and to pay for fighting these fires. The cost of restoring the water onto these landscapes is cheap compared to what we spend putting out the fires, and what gets lost in terms of a geological time, resource built over geological time that's lost to the atmosphere and all the health consequences that come with it. And this is just a perspective of really how much peat we do lose. Susan is about 5'2", so. And I'm just going to briefly tee up some of the things I said. This is something that's actionable now, but we want to take it to the next level. So these are the measures that our subcommittee is working on. We're looking at a further mechanism to address what that avoided catastrophic fire credit would look like so that we can get more carbon financing to address that piece of it. We're trying to come up with strategies and recommendations around reducing peat loss due to saltwater intrusion and sea level rise via ecological engineering approaches. Implementing soil retention practices on agricultural lands, a lot of which have shallow peat layer on them in the vicinity of these Pocosins, and using the infrastructure of the restoration to perhaps attenuate downstream flooding on adjacent agricultural lands. And then finally, on the footprint of these restorations, are there enhancements and forestry practices like reintroducing Atlantic white cedar that used to be in these systems but has largely been logged out or lost to fire that could be put back onto the landscape and has a positive carbon benefit? So stay tuned for those, and thanks a lot.
Thanks, Sarah. So, thanks, Sushma. Thanks, council members, for inviting us. I assume you want me to be the closer to wrap it all up, so that's what I'm going to attempt to do here with a few comments about resilience. What do we mean by resilience? How is EDF as a nonprofit thinking about resilience? Natural infrastructure as one way to achieve parts of resilience, and then wrap up with a policy proposal that we're working on to try to get natural infrastructure onto the ground. I did want to start, and knew there'd be a lot of great information, and thanks Adam and Chris and Jenny for going through the climate science, reminding us of why we're having this conversation, the increasingly variable weather, increased floods, but also increased droughts, increased temperatures, and the effects that that's having not just on communities, on agricultural and forestry productivity, but really on the people who live and work in these landscapes. And the opportunity for working lands to provide both a solution, sequestering more carbon, reducing carbon emissions, as well as being a critical part of the state's resource that's being affected by changing climates. So I wanted to say a few words about resilience. And this is something we're all talking about. But from EDF's perspective, resilience is really an idea of not bouncing back. We're not taking an engineering perspective where we want systems to move exactly back to where they were, especially in some of our rural communities where we're seeing systemic poverty, systemic disenfranchisement, or where ecological conditions are degraded, but really bouncing forward. So how do we think of resilience as improving those systems over time? The other piece is, I'm going to go through just a couple of pieces of this definition. I'll let you read the definition yourself. One piece is that resilience is really a capacity, it's a description of the system. It's not the goal, right? The goal is going to remain economic viability, productivity, healthy natural systems. But this is really a way for us to begin to think about how do we manage systems so that we have a safe operating system when these stressors, when climate and other impacts are increasing over time. The other piece is really this notion that we're talking about socio-ecological systems, right? We've got people actively living in, managing our working lands and our natural systems. We know this, right? This is kind of something we've all been thinking about, but too often we don't do this. And it was great to hear a lot of the conversations earlier about how to develop processes to bring these plans together with local communities, thinking about the opportunities on the working lands in the state. Similarly, when we think about this idea of human and natural well-being, there really are a series of kind of critical functions that we need to be thinking about to maintain these systems. One thing that we think a lot about is that what are these critical systems and the value judgments and the decisions that need to get made for deciding how this is going to get managed. We are rapidly moving into a time and a place of needing to make those decisions about which futures we want on our working lands in our rural communities. Similarly, the idea of support is really to convey that this is a shifting system, it's a changing system, it's something that we hope will over time be self-correcting, right? We don't want to create systems where we constantly have to go in and pump money in, where we have to constantly be supporting whatever the system is, floodplains, local communities, agricultural systems. So how do we develop systems? Resilience really forces us to think about both the maintaining and the restoring aspects. The idea of climate, right? Climate change we've been talking a lot about today. We want to really remember, though, that there are other stressors out on the landscapes, globalization, urban migration, nutrient pollution that have been occurring for long periods of time. And what we're really talking about now is how is climate exacerbating those conditions? And so we need to be thinking about both of those. And then finally, this idea that things are going to be occurring over time and unpredictably. We saw the science earlier, huge ranges. We need to be humble in how we think about moving forward. So, some kind of resilience for us is knowing when to manage a system to try to retain the current components, when we want to try to adapt that system for some different components, or when we need to just transform things altogether. And those are decisions that we can't make here in Raleigh. They need to be conversations that are occurring within the communities out on the landscape, inclusive, diverse sets of stakeholders. So again, not a lot of time to go deep into all of this, but just some ideas for us to be thinking about as we're talking about resilience. So I thought the governor's comment to the U.S. House back in February was a great both kind of forward-looking, but also a recognition of the challenge, right? And so when we begin to think about how are we going to invest in resilient strategies, how are we going to invest in natural infrastructure as one of those, we know that the current systems are not really set up to think about some of the solutions that we're talking about up here. And so we'll need to be creative. One of the pieces that we're really thinking about, again, is natural infrastructure. Lydia did a good job of introducing some of those types of practices, wetland creation, cover crops, stream restoration, reforestation, maintaining precautions. These are important for the carbon perspective, but also really important for the flood retention, flood storage capacity, nutrient reduction, wildlife habitat. And so how can we create systems to invest more in this natural infrastructure as, again, one piece of a whole suite of solutions that are needed to make our rural and our working lands resilient? One, I think, is just an imperative that we think about not just this current moment of disaster funding, but how do we set up systems of ongoing funding over time? This is in a budget-constrained environment. How do we begin to think about where those sources of funding so that we're making these investments, not just when there's disaster dollars available, but on an ongoing basis? One of the things that's, when we think about eastern North Carolina, the coastal plain, we're not in a situation where our wealthy communities are downstream and feeling the effects, right? And so imagine if Raleigh was downstream and being flooded by the working lands upstream. There would be a whole different conversation going on about how to fund some of these things. And so I think increases the role of the state and potentially other sources of dollars, carbon dollars, et cetera. And then, recognizing that our disaster dollars really do focus on, urban areas, buyouts, those types of activities, and thinking about how can we be creative to get some invested into natural infrastructure over time. The NRCS's Emergency Watershed Program is a great example of a program that really can help working lands invest in these natural infrastructure strategies that have the multiple benefits that we need over time. So I'm going to just take the last couple of minutes here. I know we're running late today, and talk about one program that we've been thinking a lot about. When we were looking at how to begin to do this resilience work, we wanted to look for programs that could deliver natural infrastructure and really be thinking about new investments in natural infrastructure, right? We also need to protect existing wetlands, existing precautions, but what we have on the landscape right now is not enough to reduce the floodwaters, to prepare for the changing climate. So one was, where can we invest in new natural infrastructure opportunities? A second was, how do we utilize existing programs? Not go out and create a whole bunch of new programs. We've got a lot of great programs in the state. With some tweaks, with some creativity, I think we can think about how to use those existing programs in a way that will help us prepare for this future with a changing climate. Third was really engaging the private sector and spurring innovation. And so there's North Carolina has a robust restoration economy, a lot of private jobs, people earn a living. How do we kind of increase that, especially in rural parts of the state where our economic growth is so important to think about? And then how do we foster collaboration across agencies? And so the place that we've begun to think is a program within DEQ called the Division of Mitigation Services. And I'm just kind of putting this up there as an illustrative example of how we might think about different programs in the state to get us to investing in nature-based solutions to achieve all the benefits we've been talking about. DMS, if you don't know, is a program with a 20-year track record working with DOT and private developers to meet the regulatory need to restore streams and wetlands when impacts happen somewhere else in the state. And so they have have that track record. They've used a lot of watershed planning. They engage the private sector. And they have a really efficient mechanism for issuing RFPs, monitoring projects, ensuring success, and then paying for those projects after they've kind of demonstrated success. And so it was a really interesting example for us to think about. And here's just some pictures up here of kind of what we're talking about in going through and doing some of maybe the larger natural infrastructure projects of really beginning to move earth, beginning to create within some of the working lands kind of large areas to hold water, or here kind of edge of field wetlands or other ways, again, to hold some of this water as it begins to come off the land to create more spongy conditions. So DMS is an example. What needs to be done, by creating a parallel account within the Division of Mitigation Services to allow them to accept not just regulatory mitigation dollars, but to accept disaster dollars, state appropriations. They could use their similar mechanisms to get those dollars out on the ground. Creating new units of measure. Right now they measure their success in acres of acres of wetlands restored, feet of stream restored. We're thinking about new metrics like flood capacity, acre feet of water held in a project, to kind of spur creativity and innovation in how we might put these projects on the ground. And then the proposal also calls for an advisory group to go out and to be advising on how to set up some of these criteria. So, this is an idea that we've talked about with lawmakers, we've talked about with agency staff. Folks, I think, are very interested in these types of ideas. I think there's a lot of other places we could do this within the state. Our vision here, what's possible, really is that a program like Division of Mitigation Services helps to build out the ecosystem restoration economy and industry in North Carolina while installing more spongy landscapes, right? Wetlands, floodplain reconnections, places to hold water over time so that our working lands are more productive, our communities are more vibrant, and our landowners are continuing to make profit over time. So I just want to kind of wrap up quickly, and I know I've gone through this very fast, but I have time for some questions. Here's some information if you want to get in touch. But just to wrap up, I think the questions are, for resilience, how do we think about processes to allow us to make decisions about where to retain, when to adapt, and when to transform different parts of our working lands? Natural infrastructure is one great tool. It's not the only tool. We need to be thinking about community buyouts, maybe farm buyouts, other types of programs as well to improve the health and safety and resilience of these landscapes. And then thinking about the existing programs that we have out there right now to really deliver some of these benefits to the ground in a way that's effective and efficient over time. So look forward to having more conversations about this. Thank you all for inviting me.
Are there any questions from the audience or from the cabinet agencies? Okay, I do want to follow up with the panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time and preparing this background material, but also giving us an update of where things are. Of course, I know it, but it's good for the council to understand it. I think as you go about doing your next stage of the projects, if you can keep in mind how you can bring the cabinet agencies that could be part of the process into your dialogue, into your stakeholder process. I understand that not all, I don't think DOT is involved in any of the stakeholder groups, but it could be an avenue for reaching out to get the right folks into your work groups. So I want to suggest that, and we can be a means for making that happen. Thank you.
We do have Sarah's report on precautions on our website, on the Natural and Working Lands website, which is under, I think, adaptation and resiliency. So if you're interested in reading a little bit more about precautions, we have their project outlined, or you can just go straight to the Pocosin Lake Wildlife Refuge site.
Okay, and now we're going to move to the public engagement portion. We only had one speaker signed up, Tanya Voigt. Yes, if you'll come up to the microphone. Thank you. You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. I don't need 2 minutes. And I'll make this quick because I know we're running over and everybody wants to go. So I wrote my question down, or more like comment, but wanted to flag this issue related to agriculture. With respect to the North Carolina Climate Assessment Report and how that translates to implementation, particularly when the panelists came to the list of risks associated with climate change, agricultural effects were acknowledged. However, it seems like some significant risks to North Carolina and North Carolina's agricultural economy is missing, particularly like heat effects on livestock and poultry. I mean, that was discussed with respect to crops, but I didn't see that on the list. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to be addressed. So my questions/comments are, first, is understanding the potential impacts to these sectors going to be pursued as part of the risk assessment? And then, secondly, how might the Interagency Council coordinate with the agricultural sector so the effects and opportunities are included, particularly in risk assessment, implementation, and planning? That's the extent of my comments. Thank you. Oh, and I should say, my name's Tanya Voigt. I'm with Duke University. I run Duke University's biogas strategy, and I am on the agricultural working group for the Natural and Working Lands group.
Thank you. And I believe there was someone from DHHS that wanted to make a comment.
Hi, everyone. My name is Virginia Guidry. I'm in the Department of Health and Human Services, and I'm new to this process. So, but a few things came to mind today when I was listening that I just wanted to raise for consideration by the panel. One is consideration of the disparate effects on different populations. I didn't hear that mentioned in the presentations today, but it may already be something you're thinking about. In particular, I'm thinking about environmental justice communities, those communities which are, much more vulnerable to heat effects, to flooding, to different things in our state. And, we're seeing this over and over again, and I really think that should be highlighted in the report that comes out in those efforts. I also wanted to point to another area that I've grown interested in, and it's really economic, but economics contribute to health, so I think they're all tied together. And I heard Adam mention it briefly, and I've heard Chris Weaver present on this before as well, and that's lost days of work. And there was some mention about lost days of work for farmers and agricultural communities due to heat, and that's, of course, very important. We are also losing days of work because of hurricanes, schools closing. I mean, these are going across all sectors. And I don't know that that's being captured yet either. And I think that's something to really consider. I've also talked with farmers and others who work outside who can't work because it's too wet. They can't use their equipment. The ground's too wet. They can't plant, and then they can't get crop insurance because they haven't planted, So I just want to encourage us to think broadly about those lost days of work and those economic impacts. I'm sure some of those are being already considered, and thanks to all of you for listening.
Did any of the other designees have anything they wanted to add? All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for a successful third meeting of the North Carolina Climate Change Interagency Council. It's a mouthful. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you all in June.